The house is very still at this hour. The grandfather clock in the front hall has just finished striking 2, and the sound of it fades into the walls the way all sounds eventually do in houses this old. The carpets absorb footsteps, the velvet curtains hold the light in, even the wind outside seems to remember to keep its voice down. She is sitting in the drawing room with no lights on except the small lamp by the writing desk, and she has not been writing. The paper is there, the pen uncapped, the ink well full, but she has not been writing. She has been watching the street through a gap in the curtain where the fabric does not quite meet, and the street is empty, and the rain is fine and continuous, and somewhere in the distance a car moves through the wet dark and disappears. This is 1931, or 1938, or 1952. The year is almost beside the point. The house is the point. The particular quality of silence in a house where a great deal of money used to live, and now lives only as memory, that is the point. The furniture is still beautiful, the silver on the sideboard still polished, the paintings still straight on the walls. But if you look carefully at the woman in the chair, if you sit quietly enough that she forgets you are there, you will notice that she has not moved in a very long time, and you will begin to understand that stillness is not always the same thing as peace. This is a story about women who said nothing, about what they knew and when they knew it, and what it cost them to keep that knowledge folded small and tucked away in the places where women kept the things they were not permitted to say out loud. It is a long story and a quiet one, and it is best heard slowly, in the dark, with no particular urgency about where it ends. Outside, somewhere a block or 2 over, a dog has just stopped barking, and the neighbourhood has returned to its particular quality of 3 in the morning quiet. A quiet different in texture from daytime quiet, more complete, more honest in some way, as though the city has temporarily dropped the performance it maintains during waking hours and is simply resting, breathing, being whatever it is when no one is watching it. Old money is a different thing than new money, though both are denominated in the same currency. New money talks about itself. New money arrives at dinner and announces its presence through the cut of a suit, or the label on a bottle, or the casual mention of a place most people cannot afford to visit. Old money does none of that. Old money has learned, across generations, that the most powerful statement a fortune can make is silence. It is there, and it does not need to explain itself, and that assurance that deep, architectural confidence is the thing that separates the merely wealthy from the genuinely established. The women of old money families in mid-century America had been trained in that silence since childhood. They had learned it at the knees of mothers who had learned it from their own mothers, a long, unbroken chain of women who understood that the correct response to almost any social situation was a composed face, a steady gaze, and a very slight inclination of the head that conveyed acknowledgement without commitment. They had been educated in the finest schools, finished in Europe in many cases, taught French and piano and the art of seating a dinner table so that no 2 enemies sat adjacent, and no boar went uninsulated by more interesting company on at least one side. What they had not been taught, what no one had thought to teach them, was what to do when the money began to disappear. Because the money did disappear. In the years between the great crash of 1929 and the slow rearrangement of American society that followed the Second World War, a remarkable number of old money fortunes did not survive. Mills that had operated for 4 generations quietly closed. Banks that had carried the same family names for a century failed on a Tuesday morning, with no warning except the locked door. Railroad fortunes evaporated when the railroads were regulated into irrelevance. Textile empires fell when cheaper labour moved south, then offshore. Real estate holdings that had seemed as permanent as geography turned out to be as fragile as the credit extended against them. And the women sat in their drawing rooms and said nothing. This was not passivity, though it looked like passivity. This was not ignorance, though they were sometimes presumed to be ignorant. The women of these families very often knew exactly what was happening. They had seen the numbers, or sensed the changes in atmosphere that precede financial catastrophe the way certain animals sense weather, that particular quality of tension in the air. The small behavioural shifts in a husband who is managing fear, the way the subject of money stopped coming up in conversation, at the precise moment it should have come up most urgently. They knew. And they said nothing. And the reasons they said nothing are more complicated, and more interesting, and more human than any simple account of female submission would suggest. Some of them stayed silent because they had no legal standing to do otherwise. A married woman in 1935 had, in most American states, no independent right to the family assets, even if those assets had come from her own inheritance. The money was his, managed by him, controlled by him, and she was a beneficiary of whatever remained after his decisions had run their course. Speaking up meant entering a legal and social structure that had been designed, at every level, to ensure she could not effectively intervene. Some of them stayed silent because speaking up would have destroyed the one thing that remained when everything else had gone the appearance of stability. The house still standing, the table still set for dinner, the children still enrolled in school. To name the catastrophe out loud was to accelerate it, to invite the creditors who were politely pretending not to notice, to lose the last of the grace period that silence purchased. Some of them stayed silent because they loved their husbands, or had once loved them, and could not reconcile the man they had married with the man who had made these choices, and in that gap between the two versions lived a complicated mercy that looked, from the outside, like complicity, and some of them stayed silent because they understood, with the clarity that comes from having been trained since childhood in the art of managing appearances, that silence was their only remaining power. As long as no one said the word ruin out loud, the performance could continue, and the performance, maintained long enough, sometimes bought enough time for the situation to change. Sometimes it did not. This is a story about the ones it did not save, about the women who watched the fortune dissolve and said nothing, and carried that silence in their bodies for the rest of their lives, and passed it to their children as part of the inheritance, and died with it still folded neatly inside them. It is a story about what silence costs, and what it was worth, and what it meant to live in a house that still looked the way houses looked before the world changed, knowing that the world had already changed completely. Let us begin in the houses themselves. Let us begin with what it felt like to live inside them, before anything went wrong, before the silence had a name. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Old money was also, in these families, a form of memory. A specific kind of memory that was carried not in documents, not in the bank records and the trust instruments and the investment statements that occupied the husband's study, but in the body and the behaviour and the trained responses of the women who had grown up in it and married into it. The memory was of how things should be done, how a table should be set, how a room should smell in winter, how a woman should move through a crowded drawing room, how silence should be maintained in the presence of information that it was not appropriate to acknowledge. This memory was the real inheritance, and it was the women who held it, and they held it in the specific way that bodies hold things below language, below conscious retrieval, in the reflexes that fire before the mind has been consulted. The houses had bones. That is the thing people who grew up in them always said first, before anything else, that the houses had bones in a way that newer construction did not. The walls were plaster over lath, not drywall, and they held the temperature differently, warming slowly and giving back that warmth slowly, keeping the interior climate stable in a way that required no mechanical assistance. The ceilings were high, 12 feet in the principal rooms, higher in the entrance hall, and that height had a purpose beyond beauty. It allowed the summer heat to rise and pool above the living level, and on August afternoons, when the outside world shimmered and wilted, the ground floors of these houses remained almost cool. The floors were oak or chestnut, or, in some of the older houses, heart pine wood so dense that a dropped coin rang against it like a struck bell. The boards had been laid by craftsmen who took the grain seriously, who matched the rings and ran the planks in the direction of the light, and over decades of wax and foot traffic, they had developed a depth of colour that no new floor could replicate. They were not uniform. They had patches where a stovepipe had once come through. They had worn paths from door to fireplace, fireplace to window, window to door. They were records of habitation, pressed into wood. The women who lived in these houses knew their floors the way sailors know their boats. They knew which board sang near the third step on the back stairs, the one that gave out a particular complaint at about 2 a.m. when the temperature dropped and the wood contracted. They knew the cold spot by the library door, where the previous generation had removed a wall and the new plaster had never quite insulated properly. They knew which windows swelled shut in July and which ones rattled in March, and they knew the specific sound the furnace made when it was about to give out, a low, irregular groan that preceded failure by exactly 4 days. The houses were expensive to maintain. This was the first thing, the thing at the center of everything, the fact that the women in these families understood, before their husbands began to understand it clearly. A house with 12 rooms and a full set of outbuildings required constant attention. The roof needed professional inspection every 5 years and replacement every 25 to 30. The plumbing, in the older houses, was a patchwork of generations copper laid over lead, galvanized iron connected to brass, fittings from 3 different eras joined by the ingenuity of successive plumbers who had worked around each other's decisions rather than correcting them. The furnace consumed oil or coal in quantities that had made sense when oil and coal were cheap and now made less sense every year. The grounds required a full-time gardener in the prosperous years, or at minimum a man 2 days a week, and the kitchen garden, if there was one, required a different kind of attention, patient and seasonal. The gutters had to be cleaned in November and again after the spring storms. The wood of the window frames needed painting every 7 years, the shutters every 5. The chimneys needed sweeping. The drive needed gravel. The well, in the properties outside the cities, needed its pump serviced. These maintenance requirements had been invisible during the prosperous years because they had been met without discussion. There was simply someone who came and handled each thing, a rotation of tradesmen who appeared and did their work, and sent invoices to the household account, which was managed by the family's man of business, or, more commonly, by the husband. The wife knew that maintenance happened. She did not always know what it cost, because she had never needed to know, because the husband had never discussed it with her, because in the architecture of these marriages, money was his domain and the house was hers, and the overlap between those 2 domains was administered from his side without consultation. When the money began to contract, the maintenance was among the first things to suffer, and the women felt this before they were told anything. They noticed that the gardener had stopped coming on Fridays, that the window paint on the east side was beginning to peel, and no one had been scheduled to address it, that the drip in the kitchen faucet that had been reported in the spring still had not been fixed by August. These were small things. Individually, they were not small things collectively. They were the first language of financial distress in a house of this kind, and women who had been born into these houses, who had grown up watching their own mothers manage them, read that language without needing it translated. The houses also had social requirements. This was the second fact, woven into the first. A house of a certain size and pedigree existed within a social world that had expectations of it. The family that occupied it was expected to entertain in ways appropriate to the house, to give Christmas parties, summer dinners, the occasional afternoon tea, to have the right people over with the right regularity, and to receive them in rooms that were properly maintained and properly staffed. This was not vanity, or not only vanity, it was economics. Social standing was credit in these circles. The perception of prosperity sustained relationships with banks, with business partners, with the legal and financial men whose good opinion kept the whole structure operational. The party was not frivolous. The party was infrastructure, which meant that as the money contracted, the parties continued. They continued because they had to continue. They continued in diminished form, fewer staff, simpler menus, wine from further down the list, but these diminishments were conducted with such discretion that guests did not notice, or politely chose not to notice. The hostess knew. She had planned the menu with the cook and understood why the Burgundy had been replaced with a California wine for the fish course, and why there were 2 footmen instead of 4, and why the flowers in the front hall were from the kitchen garden rather than from the florist in town. She presided over these economies with the same composure she brought to everything else, and said nothing about them to the guests, and said as little as necessary about them to her husband, because mentioning them would be to acknowledge what they signified. The children in these houses grew up understanding the social requirements before they understood the financial ones. They understood that certain things were done and certain things were not done, that behavior in company was a form of duty, that the family name was a kind of collateral that had to be maintained. They learned the names of the housemaids and the cook, and they learned not to discuss them in certain company, and they learned the difference between the china used for everyday meals and the china used for guests, and they knew by instinct which set was appearing on any given night. They were sensitive instruments, these children, tuned early to the frequencies of family atmosphere, The daughters in particular developed a range of perceptions that their brothers often did not. The daughters spent more time in the house. They were in the kitchen with the cook in the afternoons and in the sewing room with their mothers in the evenings, and they listened. The conversations that took place in these domestic spaces were different from the conversations at table. In the kitchen, there was news of the neighbourhood, the comings and goings of other households, the observations of tradespeople who moved between several houses on their routes, and therefore knew more about the relative prosperity of each than any single family knew about the others. In the sewing room, if the mother spoke at all, she spoke in a register that required her daughter to read between the lines, because the things being communicated were rarely named directly. What the daughters absorbed, over years, was a deep literacy in the subtext of domestic life. They learned to read the atmosphere of a house the way a physician reads a patient, not just the visible symptoms but the invisible ones, the subtle hesitations, the slight changes in temperature that precede the larger crisis. By the time they married and moved into their own houses, they carried this literacy with them, a tool they had not been taught to name but which operated in them continuously, reading their new environments with the same quiet precision. And when, in the houses they had married into, the atmosphere began to shift when the first small signals appeared, the delayed maintenance, the simplified menus, the changed quality of silence in a husband who was carrying something he had not yet decided to share, they recognized what they were reading. They had seen it before, in the houses of their childhoods, or heard it described by mothers who had seen it in the houses before that. The knowledge was in them. It had been passed down not as instruction but as atmosphere, absorbed rather than taught, which made it no less precise. The silence began there, in the moment of recognition, in the instant when the woman in the house understood what was happening, and understood also that she was not supposed to understand it, not supposed to mention it, not supposed to change her behaviour in any way that would signal to the husband that she had read the signs. Because reading the signs was one kind of knowledge, and naming the reading was another kind entirely, one that carried consequences she had also learned to anticipate. The rooms themselves had their own hierarchies and their own specific purposes that had been established by the architecture of the house and ratified by the social practices of the family that occupied it. The dining room was not simply a room where meals were eaten. It was a theatre, a formal space with particular seating arrangements that communicated social relationships, with table settings that signalled the occasion's importance, with service rituals that had been developed over decades to function as a kind of ceremony. The drawing room was the room of social life, where guests were received and conversation was conducted, and the family presented its best face to the world that it had invited in. The library was the room of private life, less formal, more personal, where the books that had actually been read sat beside the books that had been purchased for their spines. Each room required its own maintenance and its own specific attention, and in the difficult years each room developed its own relationship to the economies being practiced. The dining room was protected as long as possible, because the dining room was the social room, and the social function had to be maintained. The drawing room was protected next. The library could absorb some decline, a chair not reupholstered, a curtain not replaced when it frayed. The bedrooms could absorb more. The servants' rooms, at the top of the house, absorbed the most, because no guest ever saw them, and the women who were managing the household understood the hierarchy of visibility and applied their resources accordingly. This management of visibility was not deception in the simple sense. It was the practical application of the understanding that appearances have a function, that what a house looks like to the outside world affects what the outside world is willing to do for and with the family inside it. A house that looked prosperous kept its credit relationships. A house that looked maintained kept its social relationships. The woman who maintained the visible parts of the house while allowing the invisible parts to decline was not lying. She was managing the rate of revelation, buying time, making the most of the resources she had. This was intelligence applied to an impossible situation. It was the best available tool. The houses were beautiful. That is also true, and should not be forgotten in the telling. They were genuinely beautiful, and the women loved them, loved the bones and the floors and the plaster ceilings and the accumulated depth of life that clung to every surface. The love was real. It existed alongside everything else, the monitoring, the silence, the careful maintenance of appearances. It did not cancel out those other things, and those things did not cancel out the love. Both were present, together, in the same woman, in the same house, On the same quiet winter evening when the fire had burned down, and the children were asleep, and the husband had gone to bed, and she sat alone in the room she had arranged and tended and loved for 20 years, listening to the house settle into itself, feeling it breathe around her. She knew every sound it made. She would know, she thought, when it changed. The entrance hall deserves its own accounting, because it was the room that bore the full weight of the household's public presentation, the room every guest saw first, the room that established the register for everything that followed. The floor here was tile or marble in the grander houses, polished wood in the more modest ones, always clean, always maintained. The hall table held the calling card tray, silver and polished, a relic of an earlier social practice that had persisted as decor even after the practice itself had faded. Above the table, a mirror in a gilt frame reflected the light from the window, and beside the mirror, a small arrangement of flowers in season, or a plant in winter when the flowers were scarce. The wife managed this entrance hall with particular attention because it was the first statement the house made, and the first statement had to be correct. The kitchen was the room the guests never saw, and this made it the room where the reality of the household was most honestly present. The kitchen in a house of this kind was a working room, in the way that the drawing room was not. It had the equipment of real labour, the smells of real food, the surfaces of real use. The deal table at the centre had been scrubbed so many times that its grain stood up slightly under the touch, and the wood around the legs had been worn smooth by the shoes of generations of people who had pulled out the chairs and sat down at it. The hooks on the wall held the pots and pans in a specific order that the cook maintained with professional consistency, and anyone who moved one would find it back in its proper place by the next morning. This was the room where the household really ran, where the decisions that kept the family fed and the dinner table looking as it should look were made and executed. And the woman who knew this room, who knew its rhythms and its resources and its specific constraints in the difficult years, was the woman who knew most clearly how the household actually stood. The back stairs of the old house told their own story. They were narrower than the main staircase, steeper, unlit except by the windows that let in the morning light from the east side, and they were worn in the centre of each step by generations of domestic traffic. The maids carrying breakfast trays up in the morning and linen down in the afternoon, the cook bringing the day's supplies from the larder, the wife herself in the early morning hours before anyone else was awake, moving between the floors of the household that was hers in the most fundamental sense, not as property, not as legal holding, but as territory she knew better than anyone, and managed with an attention that never switched off. The smell of the back stairs was different from the smell of the main house, less furnished, less polished. More plainly the smell of a building, of plaster and old wood, and the faint mineral trace of the stone in the foundation. This smell was not unpleasant. It was honest. It was the smell of the house without its performance, the architecture before the social function had been applied to it, and the woman who moved through the back stairs in the early morning hours was herself. In that transit, without her performance, a woman doing the work the house required, in the part of the house that no guest ever saw, at the hour when no one was watching. The education of a girl born into old money in the first decades of the 20th century was a very particular thing, distinct from what newspapers and reformers were beginning to discuss as education for women. The reformers meant something practical by the word skills, independence, the capacity to earn one's own living. The old families meant something different. They meant the formation of a particular kind of person, one who could move through the social world that the family inhabited with the grace and confidence that the family's position required. These were not the same project, and the families in question understood this very clearly. The education began at home, as it always does. The first lessons were atmospheric. A girl in these families learned, before she learned anything a schoolbook might teach, that there was a correct way to enter a room and an incorrect way, and the difference was not about the angle of the body or the placement of the feet. It was about certainty. You entered a room as though you had always been in this room, as though the room had been waiting for you specifically, as though your presence in it was not an event but a continuation. This was not arrogance. It was, in the understanding of these families, simple preparation. A girl who could not carry herself with composure in company would be at a disadvantage her entire life, and disadvantage was something the family had a responsibility to prevent. The lessons about composure were inseparable from the lessons about silence. Composure was, in many respects, a form of silence. The composed face said nothing. It did not flinch at unpleasant information. It did not register surprise at social awkwardness. It absorbed rudeness without reflecting it, absorbed pretension without matching it, absorbed sorrow without performing it. The face was a surface on which nothing was written except a pleasant, controlled attention to the present moment, and behind that surface a great deal could exist, could think and feel and analyze and judge without any of it becoming visible. The mothers taught this, not explicitly in most cases, not by sitting a daughter down and explaining that her face was a social instrument requiring conscious management. It was taught by example, by the 1,000 small instances in which a daughter watched her mother receive news with equanimity, handle a difficult guest with warmth and firmness, navigate a social complication without allowing the complication to become visible. The daughter watched and understood that this was what would be expected of her when her time came. The schools continued what the mothers started. The finest schools for girls in this period, and there were several, with long histories and demanding expectations, understood their function as social as much as academic. They taught Latin and French, mathematics through geometry, literature, history, music, and deportment, the last of which meant not just posture and movement, but the full range of behavioral expectations that governed a young woman's conduct in public and private settings. There were rules about speech, what topics were suitable for discussion, in what company, how to redirect a conversation that had strayed into uncomfortable territory, how to disagree without giving offense or appear to agree without actually committing to the position. The rules about money were among the most emphatic. Money was not discussed, not its amounts, not its origins, not its current status. One did not speak of prices in the company of guests. One did not comment on the relative wealth or poverty of one's acquaintances. One did not ask questions about inheritances or investments or the terms of any financial arrangement. One accepted gifts without mentioning their probable cost. One declined gifts without mentioning the cost of declining. The entire subject was managed through a system of pleasant vagueness that allowed everyone in a social situation to pretend that money did not exist as a determining factor in human life, which was of course a fiction, but a fiction that social life in these circles required. This rule served the families that had established it. It protected the family's position from scrutiny during prosperous periods, when it was simply pleasant not to be reminded that prosperity was the scaffolding on which the whole social structure rested. But it served even more crucially during difficult periods. If money was not discussed, then the diminishment of money could not be discussed either. The changed circumstances remained in the private domain, protected from the social consequences that acknowledgement would bring. The family could continue to move in its social world without the reclassification that financial difficulty, publicly known, would trigger. The girls understood all of this before they could have articulated it. They understood that silence about money was a form of protection, and they understood that this protection was in the family's interest, and they understood that maintaining the protection was one of their responsibilities. When they married and moved into their own households, they carried the rule with them. They did not discuss the details of their financial lives with friends. They did not compare their household budgets with their neighbours. They received the news of financial difficulty within the household in silence, and they maintained that silence outward, and they continued to move through their social world as though nothing had changed. There were other lessons, less formal but no less important. A girl learned to read a room not in the metaphorical way the phrase is sometimes used, but literally in the sense of extracting information from the social environment without anyone being aware that information was being extracted. Who was sitting with whom, and whether they were comfortable together, which conversations were being avoided and which were consuming everyone's attention, whether the host was anxious, and if so, about what, whether the guest of honour was enjoying herself or merely performing enjoyment. This reading happened continuously, below the level of conscious attention, a background process that produced a constant stream of social intelligence. This intelligence was useful. It told a woman when to approach a conversation and when to avoid it, when a husband needed rescuing from an awkward exchange, and when he needed to be left in it to manage his own affairs. It told her when a social situation was about to become difficult and gave her the information she needed to redirect before the difficulty arrived. It was a form of management, conducted entirely through the social surface, invisible to most of the people it affected, and it was understood within these families to be one of the wife's primary contributions to the family's social standing. The education also included a version of history, though it was history of a particular kind, the history of the family itself, the stories of how the fortune had been made and maintained, the names of the men who had done it, and the marriages they had made, and the children those marriages had produced. This history was told with pride and with a certain selectiveness. The parts that reflected well on the family were told clearly. The parts that did not, the grandfather who had drunk too much, the great-uncle who had made his money in ways that did not bear examination, the cousin who had married badly and been quietly supported for 40 years. These were present in the family memory, but they were not presented. They were referenced in the oblique way that families reference their difficult history, with a significant pause, a change of subject, a look shared between the people who already knew. The girls learned the oblique references too. They learned which names caused a shift in atmosphere, and learned not to say those names in the presence of certain relatives. They learned that some parts of the family history were available for social use, and others were private, and they learned the boundary between these categories from the reactions of the adults around them. The education in family silence was as thorough as the education in French conversation, and in many ways more useful, because it was specific to the particular family and its particular sensitivities in ways that French conversation could never be. Music was a significant part of the curriculum, and not incidentally. A girl who played the piano well had something to offer in the drawing room that required no conversation she could perform, and the performance was a form of social contribution that did not require the management of her own responses to what others said, did not require the skilled navigation of a conversation that might go anywhere. She could sit at the piano and play beautifully, and be appreciated without any of the risk that conversation carried. Many of the women who had been educated in this tradition continued to play throughout their lives, into the difficult years and beyond, finding in the piano something that social life could not provide, a domain of competence that was entirely her own, that required no one else's cooperation, that produced a result that was real and audible and finished. The piano practice of childhood, those hours at the keyboard that seemed tedious at the time, produced a competence that served a different purpose in adult life than the one intended. It was not that the women performed for guests, though some of them did. It was that the piano was there, in the drawing room, and on the evenings when the house was quiet, and the worry was large, and sleep was not available, a woman could sit at the keyboard and play something she had known for 30 years and feel, for the duration of the music, the specific peace of a mind that is occupied, and the specific comfort of the familiar. The practice of childhood had laid down something permanent. It was still there when everything else was uncertain. By the time a girl from one of these families was finished with her schooling and had been presented to society and was moving through the round of parties and dinners and country house visits that preceded marriage, she had received an education that was in many ways more rigorous than the academic educations available to her male contemporaries. She had been trained in observation, in information management, in the maintenance of appearance under stress, in the careful navigation of social complexity, without allowing the navigation to become visible. She had been trained, in short, in the skills required to manage the interior of a family's social world, and those skills were formidable. What she had not been trained in, what none of the schools addressed, what none of the mothers thought to teach, because none of them had thought it would be necessary, was what to do when the information she was trained to read told her that something was seriously wrong. When the atmosphere in her own house told her, with the clarity of all that careful education, that the financial situation was not a temporary difficulty but a structural collapse. When the man she had married, the man who was supposed to manage the money in the domain they had divided so clearly between them, had made decisions that were beyond her ability to intercept or correct. The education had prepared her for social life. It had not prepared her for this, and so she fell back on the one tool the education had given her in abundance: silence, composure, the pleasant controlled surface behind which a great deal could think and feel and grieve without becoming visible. It was not the right tool for this situation, but it was the only tool she had been given, and the one she knew how to use, and she used it with a precision and a thoroughness that was, in its own way, a form of courage. The courage was real, even if it was also a trap. Both things were true. The education had given her the capacity to endure something that would have broken a woman with less training, and the education had also ensured that the endurance would be conducted in silence, alone, without the assistance that acknowledgement might have brought. She had been taught to be strong in a very specific way, and that strength was indistinguishable from the outside from submission. And sometimes it was indistinguishable from the inside too. In the drawing rooms of her childhood, she had watched her mother receive difficult news with a face that did not change. She had interpreted this, as children interpret the behavior of parents, as a statement about who her mother was, as character, as strength, as the natural expression of a particular kind of person. She had not understood it, not yet, as a choice, as something practiced, as something that had cost something to develop and continued to cost something to maintain. That understanding would come later, in her own drawing room, in her own difficult years when she heard the news in her mother's face. The finishing schools in Europe that some of these girls attended in the late teens, before they returned home to be presented, completed the education in ways that the domestic schools had not addressed. A season in Paris or Florence or Vienna provided not just the language and the cultural reference points, but a specific quality of self-assurance that came from having navigated a foreign city, a foreign household, a foreign social world, and having done it without conspicuous error. The girl who returned from Europe was recognizably the same person she had been when she left, but she wore that sameness differently with a lightness, an ease, a sense that she had tested herself in unfamiliar conditions and found herself adequate. This was its own form of education, perhaps the most useful of all, because it was education in the discovery of one's own competence. The religious education that most of these girls received ran alongside the social education in ways that were not always harmonious. The church taught a form of honesty, a commitment to truth-telling, to the acknowledgement of difficulty, to the confession of failure that was in some tension with the social training that taught the management of appearances and the protective uses of silence. The women who held both commitments, who went to church on Sunday mornings and sat in the pews with the family and received the moral instruction and carried it home and continued to practice the silence, were managing a contradiction that was never formally acknowledged. Some of them managed it by treating the religious and the social as separate domains, each with its own rules, the rules not required to be consistent with each other. Some managed it by finding, in the religious tradition, a language for what they were doing that made it something other than simply silence, a language of patience, of sacrifice, of the particular virtue of enduring difficulty without complaint. This language was available to them, and they used it, and it was not wrong exactly, but it was also not the whole truth. The summer visits to family that punctuated the calendar of these girls' childhoods were educational in the specific way that extended family gatherings are always educational, not in what was said, but in the range of models presented for how a life could be organized. The aunts who had married well and the aunts who had married less well, the cousins in prosperous households and the cousins in diminished ones, the great-aunts whose marriages had lasted, and the great-aunts whose marriages had ended, in the various ways marriages ended. All of these were visible during the 2 weeks at the family house in the summer, and the girl who was paying attention was receiving an education in the range of outcomes that a woman's life could produce. What she was being trained to want, in this catalogue, was also being demonstrated. The most admired women in these family gatherings, the ones described afterward as having done well, as having made a good marriage, as being a credit to the family shared specific characteristics. They presided over their households with evident competence. They received guests with ease. They managed their children and their staff and the social demands of their positions without visible effort. They were described as capable, as sensible, as steady. These were the terms of highest praise, and the girl who heard them applied to the women she was supposed to model herself on understood what was being valued. Not passion, not originality, not ambition in the professional sense, but the capacity for sustained, competent, composed management of a domestic world. This capacity was what was being trained for. This was the curriculum. The marriages in these families were not cold arrangements, or not only cold arrangements. This is important to say at the beginning, before anything else, because the alternative telling, the one in which the women were merely pieces moved on a board, their feelings incidental, is not accurate, and accuracy matters when the subject is someone's life. The marriages were formed within a social world that had specific preferences about who married whom, and those preferences carried weight that could not simply be discarded in favour of feeling, but feeling was present. The women in these families married men they had chosen, within the range of choices available to them, and they had reasons for their choices that were as real as anyone's reasons. The choice was made within a structured process that the families understood as natural, and the reformers of the period were beginning to understand as constraining. A girl came out into society at 18 or 19, presented at a tea, a dance, a series of dinners through a winter season, and in the 2 or 3 years that followed she encountered the range of eligible young men in her social circle, which was by design a narrow range, carefully calibrated to exclude the unsuitable and include the promising. She saw these men at the same parties, in the same houses, over the same dinners, winter after winter, and she formed impressions, preferences, inclinations. The impressions were sometimes romantic and sometimes not, but they were hers. The young men in question were the sons of families like her own. They had been educated at the right schools and the right universities. They had taken their positions in the family firm or in a law practice or in finance, or, in fewer cases, in some form of public service. They were being assessed by the same process that was assessing the young women, their suitability evaluated through the same round of social encounters, their characters read by the same maternal and paternal intelligence that was reading the girls. The assessment was mutual. Though not symmetrical, the young men had more degrees of freedom in their choices, more time available, more social permission to pursue or decline without consequence. Within this structure, the women made real choices. They chose men whose company was pleasant, whose conversation was engaging, who seemed reliable or amusing or kind, who carried themselves in ways that suggested they could be lived with for a long time. They chose men whose families were known and approved of, whose financial situations were at least equivalent to their own, whose habits and preferences and domestic expectations seemed compatible with the lives the women expected to lead. These were not romantic calculations in the modern sense, but they were genuine calculations made by whole people, not by instruments of social policy. The love that developed within these marriages was also real. It was real in the way that love always is when two people live in close proximity for decades, when they raise children together and manage a household together and navigate the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties of a shared life. It was sometimes passionate in the early years and then different, quieter, more architectural, less an event and more a condition of existence. It was sometimes complicated from the beginning, shaped by the incompatibilities that become visible only after the social performance of courtship has ended and the daily life has begun. But it was almost never absent entirely, even in the marriages that looked from the outside like the coldest arrangements. This matters because it changes the shape of the silence. When a woman who loved her husband understood that he was losing the money, the silence was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of protection. The silence of a person who could see what was happening to someone she cared about and had no ability to stop it, and could offer only the mercy of not saying it out loud, of allowing him to manage the disaster in whatever way he was managing it, of not adding to the weight of it by asking questions that would require him to speak the answers. The husbands in these situations were not all alike. Some of them were aware of exactly what they were doing and understood that they were failing, and were consumed by that understanding in ways that affected every aspect of their lives, their sleep, their health, their capacity for the social performance that the family's position required of them. These men often drank more than they had before. They became irritable or withdrawn or both. They made choices that were influenced by the panic of the situation rather than by clear analysis of it, and these choices sometimes made things worse. And the worse things became the more the panic drove the choices, a spiral that was painful to watch. Some of the husbands were not entirely aware, not in the sense of self-deception exactly, but in the sense that the human mind is capable of managing very large amounts of information about itself by simply not processing it. A man who had inherited a fortune built over 3 generations and who had never needed to think carefully about money could find himself, at 50, genuinely unable to comprehend that the money was going, because the money had always been there, and the idea that it would not continue to be there was simply outside the range of possibilities he had learned to consider. These men continued to spend with a confidence that looked, from the outside, like carelessness. From the inside, it was something closer to faith. And some of the husbands were managing situations of genuine complexity, bad luck compounded by bad markets, legitimate business decisions that had become untenable when circumstances changed, debts that had been reasonable at the time they were made, and were now crushing because the income that was supposed to service them had collapsed. These men knew exactly what was happening, and they were working as hard as they knew how to address it, and they were losing. and the loss was not entirely their fault, and they carried the weight of it with a stoic pride that their wives recognized and respected, and could not help or acknowledge without diminishing. The wives read all of these situations with the accuracy of people who had been trained in close observation and who had been watching these specific men for decades. They read the changed quality of sleep, the meal not eaten, the glass refilled more quickly than usual, the evening paper held open longer than could possibly be required by the news it contained. They read the mail, not by opening it but by noticing when it arrived and how long it sat unopened, and whether the envelopes came from known correspondents or from the formal addresses of financial institutions. They read the small deferrals, the repair postponed, the invitation declined, the new coat not purchased, and they understood that each deferral was a data point in a pattern they would have preferred not to see. They saw it. They stayed quiet. The staying quiet was an active thing, an ongoing daily decision made in full knowledge of what was being decided. It was not that they forgot, or failed to notice, or had their heads in a pleasant domestic cloud. They had excellent memories and sharp attention and the trained ability to hold a great deal of information in their minds simultaneously without allowing it to disrupt their surface behavior. The silence required vigilance. It required the continuous management of their own reactions, the daily work of composing their faces into expressions that did not betray the knowledge behind them. The knowledge was a kind of loneliness. This is perhaps the most important thing about the silence, not what it concealed from the outside world, but what it cost the women who maintained it within the private world of the marriage. They could not speak to their husbands about what they had understood, because the speaking would require the husband to respond, and the response would be a form of admission, and the admission would change the marriage in ways that could not be undone. They could not speak to their friends, because the social world in which they moved would hear about it and respond in ways that would accelerate the catastrophe. They could not speak to their mothers, in many cases, because the mothers were from the same world and held the same rules and could offer no guidance that had not already been absorbed. They could speak to no one, and so they carried the knowledge alone, in the body that sat in the drawing room and at the dinner table, and in the pew on Sunday morning, and at the charity committee and the garden party, and the school prize giving, the body that moved through the social world performing prosperity and competence, while behind its composed surface, a woman lived alone, with the knowledge of what she could see and could not say. The loneliness of this was not simple. It was not the loneliness of abandonment. She was surrounded by people. The loneliness was the loneliness of information, of knowing something that could not be shared, of living in a room with someone you loved and being unable to mention the most important thing in the room. Sometimes the husbands knew, their wives knew. There was a particular quality of communication in the long marriages, a specific register of exchange that occurred below the level of words, in the glances and the silences and the small gestures that accumulate meaning over decades. A husband who came home having learned something terrible could sometimes look at his wife and understand from the stillness of her face that she had already arrived at the same conclusion, and in that mutual understanding they could communicate something that neither of them would say, that they both knew, that they were both afraid, and that they had agreed, without discussing it, to protect each other from having to say it out loud. There were evenings in these marriages that had a specific quality, a quality that the children, if old enough, sometimes sensed without being able to name. An evening when the parents sat in the drawing room after dinner, and the radio played softly and the conversation had been conducted earlier at the table and had been concluded there, and now there was simply the room and the fire, and the two people in it, not speaking about the thing that occupied both of them, occupying themselves instead with books or needlework or the small movements of an evening that has no particular event to recommend it. The children who looked in from the doorway saw two people reading. They could not see the understanding that passed in the silence between those two people, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared difficulty, the marriage functioning in the way that marriages do, when words have been temporarily suspended, and what remains is simply the presence of two people who have agreed to be in the same room. The agreement to be in the same room was not nothing. It was, in some of these marriages, everything. The husband who could have retreated entirely into his club, into his work, into the private management of the crisis, without any acknowledgement of the person across the room from him and who did not, who came home and sat in the drawing room and allowed the evening to proceed in its ordinary way, was doing something. It may not have been enough. It may not have been what was needed, but it was the expression, in the available language, of the commitment that the marriage had always been. This was the marriage in many of these families during the years of difficulty, a shared project of maintenance. A mutual agreement to keep the structure standing for as long as it could be kept standing, for the children if nothing else, for the sake of the life they had built together, for the dignity of the family name that both of them had agreed to carry. The agreement was never spoken, the silence was its substance, and the women, trained since childhood in the art of maintaining the surface, were its primary architects. The anniversaries of these marriages, celebrated in the difficult years, had a specific quality that neither party entirely named. An anniversary in the 12th or 18th year of a marriage that had begun in prosperity and was now navigating its opposite was not a straightforward celebration. It was an acknowledgement of continuity of the fact that the two people were still here, still together, still managing the same household and raising the same children and maintaining the same name. The acknowledgement was real. The continuity was real. The celebration was of the fact that the marriage had held, which was itself the most important fact of the difficult years, the fact that had made everything else possible. The small rituals that developed in these marriages during the difficult years had their own meaning. The cup of tea brought to the husband's study in the mid-afternoon, when the household was quiet and he had been in correspondence for hours. The particular way the wife arranged the newspaper on the breakfast table, so that the financial pages were at the bottom rather than the top, a small mercy that cost nothing and communicated, without words, that she understood what the financial pages contained and had decided to soften their arrival. The evening walk, if the weather allowed, taken together around the garden, the same route, the same comments about the same beds, the same small assessments of what needed attention, which was not really about the garden at all, but about the maintenance of the habit of being together, which was itself the maintenance of something essential. The courtship letters that have survived from some of these marriages from the period before the engagement was announced, when the young man was writing to the young woman in the careful register that courtship required, are interesting documents for what they reveal about what both parties understood was being negotiated. The letters are formal without being cold, affectionate without being excessive, attentive to the domestic future in ways that revealed what the man understood about what he was asking, and what the woman was considering. The young man who wrote about the house he hoped to establish, about the life he imagined them building together, was not being unromantic. He was being precise about the terms of the marriage as he understood them, which were also the terms she understood, and the correspondence between their understandings was part of what the letters were establishing. What neither of the letters could say what the entire register of the courtship correspondence precluded was what would happen if the house they hoped to establish became untenable. What would happen if the life they imagined became impossible? What would happen to the terms they had understood so clearly when the terms themselves were destroyed by circumstances neither had anticipated? The letters were full of what was possible. They could not address what was not. And so the marriage was entered without that conversation having been had, which meant that when the conversation became necessary there was no framework for it, no precedent in the existing language of the relationship, and both parties fell back on the silence that filled the space where the language had not yet been built. In the prosperous years, before everything shifted, the financial life of an old money household operated according to a division of labour so complete that a wife might go her entire married life without knowing, in any specific sense, how much money there was, where it was held, what it was invested in, what obligations were attached to it, or what rate of expenditure it could sustain. This was not considered a deficiency in the marriage. It was considered the correct arrangement. The money was his domain. The house was hers. The boundary between the two domains was not negotiated. It was inherited. The husband received the income from the family investments, managed through a trust or a family firm or the offices of a private banker who had served the family for decades. He paid the household bills, or rather, the bills arrived and were paid from the household account, which he funded from the investment income, and the household account was available to the wife for domestic expenditures, with an understanding, often unspoken, about what kinds of expenditures were appropriate. The wife managed the domestic budget, the food, the staff wages, the housekeeping supplies, the children's clothing and schooling and medical care. This was a real management function, requiring genuine skill and attention, and the women who did it well understood it as a form of financial competence, even if they would not have described it in those terms. But the larger financial picture, the investments, the trusts, the property holdings, the debts, if there were debts, The income and its sources and its vulnerabilities, all of this lived in the husband's domain, in his study and his desk, and his mind and his correspondence with his banker and his lawyer and the other men who managed the machinery of the family fortune. The wife did not ask about it. Asking would have implied distrust or a desire to interfere in his domain, and either implication would have been uncomfortable for both of them, and discomfort was something the marriage had been designed to minimize. The documents themselves were kept accordingly. The bank statements, the investment records, the property deeds, the trust documents, the correspondence with solicitors, all of this lived in the desk, in the study, or in the filing cabinet that occupied one wall of the study, or in a strong box in the bank vault that the wife could name but had perhaps never visited. The household accounts she managed were separate and accessible: the cook's receipts, the bills from the butcher and the draper, the wages ledger. These were her papers. The others were his. Some of the wives had fathers or brothers in finance or law who might have been consulted, who might have looked at the family's financial picture and offered an assessment. But the social rules that governed these marriages also governed the relationships that surrounded them. A wife did not go to her father or her brother to discuss her husband's finances. This would be a form of disloyalty so fundamental that it would constitute a kind of betrayal, a suggestion that the husband could not be trusted to manage his own affairs, a declaration that the wife required external supervision of her own household. The family networks that might have provided information or counsel were precisely the relationships that the rules of the marriage kept at a careful distance from the financial interior of the household. The result was that when the financial situation began to deteriorate, the wife's information arrived through inference rather than documentation. She could not read the investment statements because she did not have access to them. She could not consult the bank records because she did not know which bank held what. She could not calculate the gap between income and expenditure because she did not know the full dimensions of either side of the equation. What she had was the household, and what the household told her was a version of the truth, incomplete, fragmentary, but readable by someone with the right training. The household told her things in specific ways. The reduction of the housekeeping allowance was usually the first clear signal, a conversation with the husband in which he mentioned, in a tone designed to sound like routine management rather than crisis response, that they would be reducing the household budget by a certain amount going forward. The amount named was often not large enough to alarm, and the reason given was often vague, a comment about investments, about markets, about the advisability of being prudent. The wife received this information, nodded, and began the quiet project of determining how to reduce expenditure by that amount without reducing the household's social output. She was good at this. She had been trained in economies that were invisible from the outside, and she applied them now. The conversation happened. Then it happened again, some months later, with a different number. Then again. Each conversation had the same tone, careful, not alarming, framed as a minor adjustment rather than a trend. The wife understood that the adjustment was a trend before the husband acknowledged it, because she was tracking it in a way he might not have expected, counting the conversations and the amounts and noting that the direction of movement was consistently in one direction. But she did not name the trend. She accepted each adjustment as presented, and she made the corresponding reductions in the household, and she continued to produce a household that looked, from the outside, like a household in its full prosperity. Other signals came from the tradespeople who called at the house. The grocer who shifted, almost imperceptibly, from extending automatic credit to requesting payment at delivery. The draper who mentioned, with great courtesy and evident embarrassment, that there appeared to be a small outstanding balance on the account. The plumber who had been told that the repair could wait. These conversations happened below the level of the husband's awareness, or below the level he acknowledged they arrived through the domestic channels that were the wife's domain, and she handled them with the same discretion she applied to everything else, managing the tradespeople without troubling the husband with the details, and managing the information without allowing it to disrupt the surface of the household. She became, in this way, the family's intelligence operation. She gathered the fragments, the changed allowance, the deferred repairs, the shifted credit arrangements, the quality of the husband's sleep, the length of time he spent with particular correspondence, and she assembled them into a picture that she held privately, updated continuously, and never presented to anyone in its full form. The picture was often more accurate than the information the husband was working from, or at least it was accurate in different ways. It captured the texture of the deterioration, the daily evidence of how a financial problem registers in the small materials of domestic life, rather than the documentary record of investments and losses that the husband might have been reading. The legal framework that surrounded this information gap was brutal in its simplicity. A married woman in most American states, through the first half of the 20th century, had no independent legal standing in relation to the family's assets. The property was his, the debts were his, the decisions were his. She had a claim to maintenance, to being supported from the family assets, but she had no mechanism for intervening in the management of those assets, no legal right to demand information, no standing to challenge financial decisions she believed were wrong. Her silence was not just social custom, it was enforced by a legal architecture that had been constructed specifically to keep her out of the room where the decisions were made. Some of the women had lawyers of their own, inherited advisors from their family of origin, who maintained a quiet watch on the family's financial health as a courtesy to the wife's parents or brothers. These advisors sometimes communicated what they knew in oblique ways, a letter suggesting a visit, a comment over tea that seemed casual but carried a specific weight, a question framed as general interest that was actually a probe for particular information. The wives understood these communications for what they were, and responded in kind, passing information in both directions through channels that maintained their informality even when their purpose was entirely deliberate. This network of oblique communication was the closest thing many of these women had to actual financial counsel. It was imperfect, partial, indirect, slow to transmit information that might have been time-sensitive, but it was something, in a landscape where formal access to the family's financial information was essentially impossible. The women who had it were somewhat better positioned than those who did not, though better positioned in this context meant only that their information arrived marginally faster, not that they had any greater capacity to act on it, because the absence of information was ultimately less important than the absence of standing. Even a woman who knew exactly what was happening, who had assembled from her fragments a picture that was essentially accurate, could not do anything with that knowledge within the legal framework of her marriage. She could not instruct the banker. She could not negotiate with the creditors. She could not sell the property or consolidate the debts or redirect the investments. She could not sign anything that committed the family to a different financial course. All of those capabilities resided with the husband, and all she could do was watch and understand and practice the silence that had been her training. The ledger she was never shown was not just a document, it was a relationship. It was the formal structure of what she was permitted to know about the life she was living, and the structure had been designed to keep her ignorant, and the ignorance had been presented to her as a form of consideration, as though not burdening her with the details of finance was a gift, a release from responsibility, a comfortable arrangement that left her free to manage the domestic world without the additional weight of the larger picture. The women who held both the domestic management and the inferred larger picture, silently, privately, without acknowledgement, understood this characterization as the fiction it was. The relationship between the wife and the family's banker was one of the most carefully maintained institutional relationships in these households. The banker knew things the full picture, the real numbers that the husband sometimes obscured and the wife was never shown directly. These were long relationships, inherited like the silver, the current banker having been introduced to the current husband by the previous banker when the family was still prosperous. He knew the family's history across decades. He was the family's financial memory, the keeper of the record that no one inside the family had ever been shown in full. The wife who encountered the banker in social situations at a dinner party, at a charity event, in the general round of life in a town where everyone of a certain class knew everyone else, read the quality of his attention to her with the same skill she brought to every other form of social intelligence. The banker who offered an extra few moments of conversation, who greeted her with a particular warmth that acknowledged her without naming what it acknowledged, was communicating something. The banker who was slightly less available than usual, who excused himself from a conversation in a way that suggested preoccupation, communicated something different. She filed these observations in the private record she was maintaining and updated her picture accordingly. What she could never do was act on this information in any formal way. She could not use what she had inferred from the banker's behavior to intervene in the family's finances. She had no standing to intervene, because intervening would have required naming what she knew, and naming it would have been a form of betrayal of the privacy the marriage required. She could only watch and know, and carry the knowledge in the place where all the knowledge was carried, the private interior that was her only domain, the one domain entirely hers, where no one could demand an accounting, and the assembled picture lived in complete, permanent, unreachable silence. The probate records that surface when these families' estates were settled are some of the most revealing documents in this history, because they show, with a specificity that the living obscured, exactly what had happened to the money. The records list assets and liabilities with a bureaucratic completeness that the social world had never permitted. The house, appraised at a value that told the story of deferred maintenance in numbers. The investments, listed by type and by current value, the gap between their purchase price and their present value, a silent index of the decisions that had been made. The debts, enumerated with the same impersonality, each creditor named, each amount specified, the total adding to a number that answered, at last and too late, the question the wife had been carrying for years. The records did not explain, they simply listed. But the listing was already the whole story. Compressed into columns, the decades of performance reduced to arithmetic. The men who managed these families' legal affairs, the trust officers and estate lawyers who had served the family for decades, occupied a specific position of knowledge that was both extensive and constrained. They knew, in many cases, the full picture of the family's financial situation with a precision that neither the husband nor the wife possessed. They saw the accounts, the investments, the debts, the trajectory. They understood what the numbers meant in terms that were not available to people without their professional training. And they were constrained by their professional obligations from communicating this knowledge to the parties who needed it most, or from communicating it in the direct, unambiguous way that might have been useful. The conversations these lawyers had with the wives of their clients, conversations that happened occasionally, obliquely, in social settings or in the careful decorum of a formal office call, were performances of their own kind. The lawyer who visited the household in an official capacity, who sat in the library and spoke with the husband about the family's affairs while the wife poured tea and then withdrew to leave the men to their business, had information that the tea and the withdrawal and the professional discretion prevented him from sharing with the woman who had just poured it. The wife understood this. The lawyer understood it. They exchanged pleasantries, and she returned to the kitchen, and the information remained where it was. October 1000, 929 arrived in the newspapers before it arrived in the houses. The headlines were dramatic, and the details were precise. The volumes traded, the points lost, the names of banks and brokerage houses that had been overtaken by the flood. The women in the old money houses read these newspapers at the breakfast table and understood some of what they were reading, and not all of it, because the workings of the stock market were not something they had been educated in, and the specific mechanisms of margin debt and leverage positions, and the cascading failures of interconnected financial institutions were outside the range of knowledge that had been considered appropriate for them to acquire, but they read the atmosphere of the morning with perfect clarity. The husband who came down to breakfast and ate nothing, or ate mechanically without tasting. The husband who had already telephoned his banker before the household was awake, whose voice had a particular quality when he came back to the table controlled, but controlled in a way that required effort. The way composure always requires effort when it is working against something real. The husband who opened the newspaper and read it, then folded it carefully and set it aside and said something about the weather or asked about the children's plans, a conversation so ordinary in its surface that it communicated, by contrast, the extraordinary quality of what was not being said. The women poured the coffee and talked about the weather and the children's plans and watched their husbands with an attention that was invisible because it had been trained to be invisible. They were reading everything, the posture, the set of the shoulders, the speed of the breathing, the slight hesitation before a spoonful of egg was brought to the mouth and then replaced in the bowl, untouched. They were compiling information, filing it away in the place where information was kept, the private interior where all of the gathered fragments were stored and organized and continuously updated. In the days and weeks that followed the initial crash, the households adjusted without being told to adjust. The wife who understood that something had happened, even without knowing its exact dimensions, began quietly reducing the household expenditures she controlled, cutting the little extras that had been comfortable during the prosperous years, the flowers from the florist replaced with flowers from the garden, the better cuts of meat replaced with the less expensive ones that required more skill to prepare, but were indistinguishable on the plate if cooked properly. She did not announce these changes. She made them, and the household absorbed them, and the appearance of the household's life continued without interruption. This response was not always correct. Sometimes the husband's situation was not as bad as the wife had feared, and the economies she had begun to practice were unnecessary. And when the husband eventually communicated that the situation was being managed, she quietly restored the expenditures to their previous levels without mentioning that she had reduced them. The reverse engineering was smooth because the reduction had been smooth. No one had noticed the change in either direction. But more often the situation was worse than the wife had feared, worse than what the fragments she could access had suggested, worse than the husband had yet been able to communicate, because he had not yet fully comprehended it himself. The market losses of October 1929 were followed by months of continued decline, and then the economic contraction that followed the financial collapse, and then the business failures and the banking failures and the unemployment, and the downward spiral that would take another decade to fully arrest. The old money families were not immune to this. The old money families were vulnerable in ways that were specific to their structure. The fortunes that had been built in the 19th century in railroads, in manufacturing, in the extraction of natural resources were often held in trust structures that had seemed perfectly appropriate in their time, but which now proved inadequate. The trusts had been designed to preserve capital across generations, to prevent any single generation from dissipating the family wealth through extravagance. They held the assets in a form that could not be quickly liquidated, could not be restructured in response to changing conditions, could not be moved out of the failing industries that had built them and into something less exposed. The trustee's duty was to the terms of the trust, not to the current economic reality, and the terms of the trust often required holding assets whose value was in freefall. The income from these trusts collapsed as the underlying businesses failed. The railroad dividends that had funded a family for 3 generations simply stopped arriving. The mill shares that had produced a reliable quarterly payment became shares in a mill that had closed, shares worth what anyone would pay for the equipment of an idle building, which was almost nothing. The bonds that had seemed like the safest of all investments, government bonds, corporate bonds, the obligations of apparently permanent institutions defaulted in numbers that the previous generation would have found impossible to imagine. The wives felt this in the household account before they were told about it in any formal way. The quarterly transfer from the investment income into the household account, which had arrived reliably for as long as they had been married, was smaller than usual, and then smaller still, and then one quarter it did not arrive at all, and the cook was asking about wages, and the wife was calculating how many weeks the current balance could cover the essential expenses before something would have to be said. Some of the conversations that had been avoided for months happened at this point. The husband came to his wife and explained in the language of understatement that these marriages used for their most serious communications, that there were some difficulties with the income this year, that they would need to make some adjustments, that he was working with his lawyers and his banker to address the situation. The wife listened. She said, perhaps, that she understood, that she was sure it would be sorted out, that she would see what she could do to reduce the household costs in the meantime. She did not say that she had known for months. She did not say that she had already begun the reductions. She simply absorbed the formal communication and continued the private management that had been underway since October. What followed in the households of these families in the years after the crash was a kind of life that looked, from the outside, almost exactly like the life that had been lived before, and was, from the inside, entirely different. The difference was not in the events. The dinners still happened, the parties still happened in attenuated form, the school terms continued and the church attendance continued and the round of social obligation continued. The difference was in the quality of attention behind everything, the continuous low-level calculation that accompanied every domestic decision, the running assessment of what could be sustained for how long and what would have to be surrendered and in what order. The wife managed this calculation alone. She managed it in her head, because writing it down would have required a document that could be found, and the document would have had to go somewhere in the household, and putting it somewhere in the household was a communication she was not ready to make. She managed it through the daily decisions of the housekeeping, which were her domain and which she made without consulting anyone. She managed it through the conversations with the cook and the housekeeper that happened in the domestic spaces of the house, away from the study and the front rooms where the husband spent his time, conversations that were practical and specific, and never framed as crisis because the cook and the housekeeper had their own families and their own anxieties and deserved, insofar as possible, to come to work in a household that felt stable. The stability was performance, as so much else was, but the performance had a purpose. A household that felt stable kept its staff, and a household that kept its staff could maintain the appearance of prosperity for longer than one that didn't. And maintaining the appearance of prosperity was itself a form of financial strategy, because the credit and the social standing and the business relationships that depended on the family's reputation for soundness were real assets, worth protecting for as long as they could be protected, bought time against the moment of formal acknowledgement that everyone, internally, already knew was coming. The women who managed this interval months in some families, years in others, were doing something that required genuine skill and continuous effort, and the consumption of their own emotional resources in ways that no one fully acknowledged. They were sustaining the household through a crisis they had not created and could not resolve, using tools that were fundamentally inadequate to the scale of the problem, producing outcomes that were temporary by definition. The effort was real. The intelligence it required was real. The loneliness of doing it without acknowledgement, without assistance, without the possibility of speaking about what they were managing, was also real. The morning after the crash, the many mornings after, the years of mornings after had a particular quality in these households. The coffee was poured. The newspaper was brought in. The children left for school. The husband went to his study or to his office or to a meeting with his banker, and the wife went to the kitchen to speak with the cook, and the day began, and it looked like every other day from the outside. This is the thing to hold in mind. It looked like every other day. The specific texture of the Depression years in these households had a quality that is difficult to convey from the outside, because the outside saw so little of it. The difficulty was interior, lived in the small domestic decisions of daily life, in the morning calculations over the household account, in the conversation with the cook that had acquired a new precision and a new constraint that had not been there before. From the outside, the household continued to function. From the inside, it was a structure under continuous strain, maintained by will and skill, and the refusal of everyone in it to acknowledge what the maintenance cost. The women who managed this period often described it later when they described it at all in terms of a particular kind of alertness that never quite switched off. A state of continuous readiness, a monitoring of conditions that was always running in the background of everything else they did. They cooked and tended the children and received guests and sat at dinner tables and attended church, and the whole time the monitoring continued, noting the signals, updating the assessment, calculating what was sustainable for how long, and what the next decision would need to be. It was exhausting in the way that sustained vigilance is always exhausting, not dramatically, not in moments of crisis, but slowly, accumulating, taking something from the reserves that did not fully replenish overnight. Some of them wrote to their sisters during these years, or to school friends who had married into similar situations, letters that were careful in what they said and careful in what they did not say. A letter could travel between two women who both understood the situation without ever naming the situation, exchanging news of children and weather and household matters in a tone that communicated, beneath the practical surface, that they were managing and that they knew the other was managing, and that the knowing was itself a form of company. These letters were correspondence as solidarity, conducted in the only register available. The Saturday afternoons in October, as the Depression deepened, had a specific quality in these households that remained in the memory of the children who experienced them. The particular silence of a house on a Saturday afternoon, when the husband was in his study with the door closed and the wife was in the kitchen or the garden, occupied with the domestic work that Saturdays allowed time for, and the children were in the house but not certain where they should be. The atmosphere too dense for the usual energies of a weekend afternoon. These afternoons were the texture of the crisis, as it was actually lived, not the dramatic moments of revelation or decision, but the long middle period of sustained tension maintained in the ordinary container of a Saturday, with the smell of pot roast from the kitchen and the sound of a car on the street outside, and the sense, which the children could not have named but nonetheless felt, that the adults in the house were managing something that required their full attention and could not be interrupted. The radio arrived in these households in the late 1920s and established itself so quickly as a fixture of domestic life that within a few years it was impossible to imagine the house without it. The radio changed the texture of the household's evenings, provided a presence. a voice, a continuous thread of sound that gave the silence of the room a different quality than it had before. The news broadcasts, in the early 30s, delivered information that the household had previously received only through the morning newspaper, and the delivery was immediate, urgent, spoken aloud in the room rather than read privately at the breakfast table. This changed the experience of bad news in a specific way. The news of a bank failure or a market drop that had previously arrived in print, quietly, with the option of folding the page and setting it aside, now arrived in the voice of a broadcaster, whose tone communicated the weight of what he was saying. The wife who was in the room when such news arrived, who was mending or writing letters or managing some domestic task while the radio played, received it differently than she would have from the printed page. She received it in her body as well as her mind. The news from the radio was not something she could set aside and return to. It was in the air of the room, already heard by everyone who was present, already part of the shared atmosphere of the household in a way that the private newspaper reading had not been. She managed her response accordingly, the composed face in place before the broadcaster had finished speaking, the deliberate continuation of whatever she had been doing, the signal sent to the children or the servants or the husband himself that this news had been received and was being processed and was not going to change the surface of the evening. Food is one of the places where money shows itself most clearly, which is precisely why the women of these households worked hardest to make sure it showed nothing at all. The dinner table was a social document. Guests read it with the same attention that the women had been trained to apply to social atmospheres, noting the china, the crystal, the number of courses, the quality of the wine, the presence or absence of hothouse flowers, the composure of the service. A table that read correctly communicated prosperity, good management, and social confidence. A table that read incorrectly communicated something the family could not afford to communicate. The economies of the reduced table were an art form, developed over the difficult years with a precision and creativity that deserved more recognition than it ever received. The first principle was that the reductions had to be invisible from the outside. The goal was not a cheaper dinner. The goal was a dinner that cost less but looked the same, or looked good enough that the difference was imperceptible to anyone who was not already looking for it. This was harder than it sounds, because the guests at these dinners were often themselves from similar backgrounds and possessed the same trained eye for social surfaces that the hostess was counting on their not deploying. The second principle was hierarchy, protecting the most visible economies last, reducing the least visible ones first. The china was never reduced, because the china was immediately apparent and instantly communicative. The crystal was never reduced. The table linen was maintained. These were the elements that announced the dinner's occasion before a single dish arrived, and they were the last things to go. What could be reduced without announcement was the food itself. The number of courses, the quality of the ingredients within each course, the presence or absence of certain luxury items that had been routine before but could now be quietly omitted. The cook was the essential collaborator in this project. The cooks in these households were not merely functionaries. They were skilled professionals who had worked in other households of the same kind, who understood the social requirements of the table in the same way the wife understood them, and who had their own professional pride in producing a dinner that reflected well on the household. The conversation between the wife and the cook, in these years, was one of the most important conversations in the household, and it happened in the kitchen, informally, often standing, and it required a particular kind of honesty that was rare in any other domestic space. The wife could tell the cook that the budget was reduced, because the cook needed to know in order to plan. The cook received this information professionally, without judgment, because the cook had worked in other households through other difficult periods and understood that these things happened, and because the cook's own livelihood depended on the household's survival. Between them, they worked out the menus that could be produced within the new constraints. Dishes that were elegant in presentation but economical in ingredient, preparations that required more labor but less expensive raw material, compositions that used the whole of a thing rather than the most prestigious part. A whole chicken prepared thoughtfully for a dinner table could be as impressive as a more expensive cut, if the preparation was right and the presentation was right, and the story of how it had arrived at the table was never told. Seasonal eating, which the prosperous households had practiced as a preference, became in these years a necessity pursued with new creativity. The kitchen garden was suddenly important again, after years of being supplementary, a pleasant source of summer vegetables but not relied upon for the serious provisions of entertaining. Now the garden was planned with the dinner table in mind. The wife and the cook went through seed catalogues in January with a new purposefulness, choosing varieties that would produce abundantly and that would read well on the plate, that could be stretched across multiple preparations, that could be preserved for the months when the garden was not productive. Preservation became a serious occupation. The summer months, when the garden was at its height, were spent in the kitchen in a way that would not have been familiar in the prosperous years, the wife alongside the cook, putting up vegetables and fruits in the quantities needed to support a winter of careful entertaining. This was physical work, requiring hours of standing over the canning pot, of sterilizing jars and testing seals and labeling and storing in the cool of the cellar. The women who had grown up in these households had not been expected to do this work themselves. They had overseen it, planned it, made decisions about what was preserved and in what quantity. Now they were present in it, and it took something they had not expected, a quiet satisfaction in the competence of it, in the concrete usefulness of filling a shelf. The wine required a particular subtlety. Wine was not optional in these households, but the budget for it contracted sharply with everything else, and the visible consequences of reduced wine, a lesser vintage, a different region were readable by exactly the guests the wife most needed to impress. The solution was often to move toward wines that were genuinely good but less conventionally prestigious, about which a confident, knowledgeable hostess could speak with authority and even enthusiasm, framing the choice as a discovery rather than a concession. This required that the wife actually know something about wine, which some of them did and some of them did not, and the ones who did not began to learn, because knowledge was a form of social capital that cost nothing and returned considerably. There were other economies that were similarly intellectual in character. The flowers, as previously noted, moved from the florist to the garden to the fields and roadsides when the garden was not in season. A woman who knew which wild things were beautiful in arrangements, who could walk a hedgerow in March and return with something that arranged well in a silver bowl, had translated a financial necessity into an aesthetic choice. The guests who received such an arrangement might not have recognized it as economy at all, might have found it charming, characterful, distinctively unconventional in a way that formal florist arrangements were not. The guest list was managed with equal care. The social world of these families was not static, and the years of difficulty had their own social sorting. Families whose situations had deteriorated moved toward each other by a kind of gravity, while families whose situations had improved or held steady moved, often without intending to, in the other direction. The wife was sensitive to this sorting, and worked with it strategically, composing gatherings with the complexity of a chess problem, choosing combinations of people that would produce evenings of genuine quality without requiring the expenditure that entertaining more prosperous guests would have demanded. A dinner for 8 people who were all navigating their own economies, all performing the same careful normalcy, produced a different kind of evening than a dinner for 8 people at wildly different points on the prosperity scale. The former group understood each other implicitly, could relax slightly in the company of people who were managing similar anxieties, could produce an evening of warmth and genuine connection without the performance pressure that required the most expensive props. The wives understood this and used it, composing their guest lists to create evenings that were real, even when the circumstances that produced them were precarious. But the most significant economy, the one that required the greatest ingenuity and produced the least visible result, was the economy of labor. The staff of these households had been reduced, sometimes severely, from a cook and 2 maids and a butler and a gardener, to a cook and 1 maid, then to a cook and no maid, then in some cases to a cook alone, and then to no cook, with the wife managing the cooking herself. Each reduction was handled with the same care applied to everything else. The staff who were let go were thanked and given references and, where possible, placed in other households, the process managed with as much grace as the situation allowed. The work they had done did not disappear. It was absorbed by the wife. This absorption happened gradually enough that it might not have been experienced as dramatic at the time. 1 maid instead of 2 means certain things are done less often, or done differently, or done by someone else, which is to say, by the wife. The bed linen is changed every 10 days instead of every week. The silver is polished monthly instead of weekly. Certain rooms are cleaned thoroughly less often, though they are always maintained to a standard that would not alert a casual visitor. The wife learns or relearns from her mother's instructions or her own early experience in more modest circumstances how to maintain a house of this size with less assistance than it was designed to require. She learns it in her body, not just as knowledge but as physical habit, the particular technique for polishing a wooden floor without a maid, to help the rhythm of the laundry on wash day, the sequence of morning tasks that have to be completed before the household is ready for the day. She becomes competent at these things, genuinely competent in the way that competence comes from repetition and attention, and the competence is private, practiced in the early morning or the late evening when the guests have gone, and the husband is in his study and the house is quiet. The table, through all of this, continued to look like a proper table. The flowers were different, the wine was different. There were fewer courses, or the courses were simpler, but the china was the same, and the linen was the same, and the candles were lit at the same hour, and the hostess came down in a dress that was perhaps not as new as last year's but was beautifully maintained, and the evening proceeded as evenings in these houses had always proceeded. The guests ate and drank and talked and went home, and none of them mentioned the reduced table, because there was an etiquette around not mentioning, and because some of them were managing reduced tables of their own, and the silence around it was mutual. The art of the reduced table was not only about food. It was about time, and the deployment of time as a resource that was, unlike money, still fully available. In the prosperous years, time had been purchased. The cook's time, the maid's time, the gardener's time, the various tradespeople's time. In the difficult years, the wife's own time expanded to fill the gaps. She was in the kitchen earlier and stayed later. She was in the garden on afternoons that had previously been available for other things. She was at the ironing board on mornings that had previously begun with leisure. The time was hers now, in a way it had not been before, and she gave it to the household with a thoroughness that was both practical and, in its own way, a form of pride. The pride was real and deserves acknowledgement. There is a particular satisfaction in competence that has been earned through difficulty, in the discovery that a skill you thought you lacked is actually available to you, requires only that you practice it. The wife who discovered that she could manage a household of 12 rooms on a staff of one, that she could keep the visible rooms clean and presentable, that she could produce meals from the kitchen garden that satisfied both nutritionally and socially, that the household could continue to function at a level that preserved its dignity. This wife had found out something about herself that the prosperous years had not required her to know. The guests who came to dinner in those years and found it good, and they did find it good, because the woman preparing it had decided that it would be good, had brought the same intelligence to the reduced resources that she had previously brought to the abundant ones. Those guests were recipients of something that cost more than they knew, not in money, which was spent carefully and efficiently. In the other currencies, attention, labour, ingenuity, the sustained effort of a woman who had decided that the household would not be diminished in the ways that mattered, whatever was happening in the ways that did not. The autumn canning was one of the rituals that acquired new seriousness in the difficult years, and it is worth dwelling on it for a moment because it represented, in concentrated form, much of what the difficult years required. The canning was physical work that produced a tangible and visible result, rows of sealed jars in the cellar, each one a small stockpile against the lean months ahead. It was work that required knowledge and attention, the correct sterilization, the correct processing times, the recognition of a seal that had not taken and would need to be redone. It was work that connected the woman doing it to the women who had done it before her, her mother, her grandmother, the long line of women who had put up the summer's abundance against the winter's scarcity. It was work that the prosperous years had made unnecessary, and that the difficult years had restored, and the restoration was not only practical, it was a form of grounding, a reminder that certain skills once learned are permanent, that competence accumulated over generations is available to the person who reaches back for it. The improvised recipes that emerged from the difficult years in these kitchens were sometimes genuinely remarkable in their ingenuity, and some of them became permanent features of the household's cooking long after the scarcity that had produced them had passed. The dish invented to stretch a small amount of meat across a dinner for 8, the preparation that transformed the less desirable cuts into something that read well on the plate, the sauce developed from kitchen garden, produced that elevated a simple piece of fish into something the guests remembered, and asked after these were real culinary achievements, developed under constraint in the way that constraints often produce unexpected creativity. The cook, who was managed well during these years, who was trusted and respected, and given the kitchen as her domain. Even when that domain was operating under conditions she had not signed up for, produced remarkable food. She produced it because the challenge engaged her professional pride, because the trust and respect made her willing to apply her full skill to conditions that might otherwise have led a lesser cook to simply reduce her efforts along with the budget. The wife who understood this, who managed the cook relationship with the care it required, got food that was genuinely good from ingredients that were genuinely limited. It was one of the small and significant victories of the difficult years. The dinner that was actually better than necessary, that exceeded what the budget suggested it should be, because two skilled women had decided together that it would be. There is a particular phenomenon in the history of these families that is documented, when it is documented at all, only in the peripheral accounts in the letters that survived the estate sales, in the diaries that children found after their mothers died, and sometimes preserved and sometimes did not, in the memories of grandchildren who reported conversations overheard in hallways, or the specific quality of a grandmother's silence at certain moments. The phenomenon is this. In family after family, across the economic disasters of the middle 20th century, the wife knew before the husband told her, and in many cases before the husband fully knew himself. This was not magic. It was the result of the same training and the same position within the household that had shaped everything else in these women's lives. They were positioned in the domestic interior of the family's life, and the domestic interior registered financial stress in ways that preceded the formal recognition of it. The reduced household allowance, the changed behavior of tradespeople extending credit, the quality of the husband's sleep, the frequency of his evenings spent in correspondence rather than company, all of these were information, and the women assembled it with the attentiveness of people for whom attention was both a trained skill and a social obligation. What they did with the advanced knowledge varied. Some of them used it to prepare not by confronting the situation formally, since confrontation was not available to them, but by quietly reducing the household's exposure to the crisis in every way that their domestic domain allowed. They paid down small outstanding bills before the bills could become a source of social embarrassment. They made themselves more self-sufficient in the kitchen and the garden, reducing the household's dependence on credit relationships with tradespeople. They made small disposals of personal jewellery, not the important pieces, not the pieces that represented the family's history, but the small redundant ones, the pieces that could be quietly converted to cash without anyone noticing or commenting. The jewellery disposals deserve a moment of attention because they represent one of the few forms of independent financial action available to the women of these families. Personal jewellery was, in most cases, legally a woman's separate property gifts, given to her by her husband or her family, not subject to the same trustee control as the marital assets. This was a narrow category, and a small source of funds relative to the scale of the crisis, but it was real, and the women who used it were using it with a practical understanding of their own situation that the legal architects of their position had perhaps not fully anticipated. The pieces that went first were the ones that were worn least, that would not be missed in conversation, that could be carried to a discreet jeweller in a city, not quite one's own, and exchanged for cash without anyone in the social circle becoming aware of the transaction. The women who did this were not sentimentally attached to these pieces. They were attached to the family, to the household, to the stability that the cash could help to purchase for a little longer. The sentimentality, if it existed, was redirected. They kept the pieces that mattered. They sold the ones that didn't. It was a precise, deliberate act of financial management, conducted within the only financial domain they controlled. Other women used the advanced knowledge differently, not to prepare financially, but to prepare emotionally, to do the private work of grieving the loss before the loss was formally announced. This was a way of managing the eventual revelation, of ensuring that when the husband finally said the thing he had been not saying for months or years, the wife would be able to receive it with the composed equanimity that the situation required, that she would not break in front of him at the moment when he most needed her not to break. The grief was real, but it was practiced in private, absorbed in the small hours of the morning, processed in the solitude of the garden or the quiet of the room after the children were in bed, until it had been metabolized into something manageable. The women who had done this processing described it, when they described it at all, as a form of practical preparation. Not mourning, exactly the loss had not been confirmed, might still not arrive, might still be averted through some intervention of the husband's that she was not privy to, but a preparation for the possibility, a rehearsal of the conversation and the days that might follow it, so that when it came she was not ambushed by it. She had already lived it, quietly, in the interior. The actual event, when it arrived, was an echo of something she had already heard. This was not the same as being unaffected. The confirmation of what had been feared, when it finally came, still landed. There was still grief in it, still the particular sorrow of watching something that had seemed solid and permanent reveal itself as more fragile than believed. The preparation reduced the initial shock, but did not eliminate the weight of it. What it did was give her a few seconds' advantage at the moment of hearing, enough time to compose the face into the expression that the moment required, the expression that said she understood, that she was with him in this, that they would manage it together. Together is the word that needs attention here. The women of these families did not typically respond to financial crisis by separating from their husbands, by asserting their own interests against the husband's interests, by seeking legal protection of whatever independent assets they might have, by withdrawing into a protective stance. The legal structures that would have enabled this were largely unavailable to them, but beyond the legal structures was something else. The marriage was the unit of survival, not the individual. The family as an entity was what had to be protected, and the wife's role in the protection was maintenance and management and the continuous production of normalcy, not the extraction of herself from the situation. This collective stance had costs that were not evenly distributed. The husband who had made the financial decisions, whose actions or inactions had contributed to the crisis, retained his social standing in ways that the wife's standing was now partly employed in maintaining. He was still the head of the household, still the person whose professional relationships and public reputation were being protected by the household's continued appearance of prosperity. The work of that protection fell on the wife. The standing it protected was primarily his. The arrangement was not equal, even in the marriages where it was genuinely loving. Some of the women understood this inequality with great clarity and chose it anyway, not because they were resigned to it, but because they saw no alternative that was better. The available alternative, separation, the acknowledgement of the collapse, the social consequences that would follow, did not look, from inside the situation, like freedom. They looked like the end of everything the family had been, the dismantling of the structure that the children's lives were built on, the surrender of the one remaining asset that was still real, the appearance of stability. Choosing the silence was, for many of these women, a calculation. It was not a calculation made freely, but it was made with open eyes. Others understood the inequality less clearly, or understood it but could not quite admit the understanding even to themselves, because the alternative understanding that the marriage was extracting from them in ways that were not reciprocal was incompatible with the love they had for their husbands, with the identities they had built as wives and mothers and managers of these households. The two understandings could not easily coexist, and so one was suppressed in favour of the other, and what was suppressed tended to emerge in other ways. In the particular quality of exhaustion that settled into these women over the difficult years, in the health problems that arrived in their 50s, when the sustained stress of the previous decade took its biological toll, in the dreams they sometimes reported to their doctors and sometimes did not. The doctors of the period had a category for the kind of distress that these women presented, with a collection of symptoms including fatigue, headaches, digestive problems, insomnia, and what was described as nervous exhaustion. The category was not the same as a diagnosis. It was a description of the presentation, and the treatment prescribed was usually rest, and sometimes medication of one kind or another, and sometimes the advice to take a holiday, as though the source of the exhaustion were the holiday's absence rather than the years of sustained silent management. The doctors were not unkind. They simply did not have a framework for understanding the specific nature of what they were treating. What they were treating, in many cases, was the long-term cost of the silence, the body keeping score of everything the mind had been asked to hold without expressing. The physical toll of the sustained vigilance, the continuous monitoring, the management of the household's appearance while managing the household's reality, the love for a husband whose decisions had created the situation, and the inability to say anything about those decisions or the feelings they generated. The cost was not visible in the social world. It was visible in the body, eventually, in the middle age of women who had carried too much for too long in too much quiet. They had known first. And the knowing, without the ability to act on the knowing, without anyone to tell, without the relief of acknowledgement or the practical assistance of intervention, the knowing was its own kind of weight. They had been given the intelligence without the authority, the observation without the agency, the understanding without the standing, and they had managed it. Because managing was what they did, what they had been trained to do, what the situation required of them, and what in many cases no one else in the household was able to do. They managed it, and they said nothing, and the houses continued to stand. The question of when the knowing became unbearable is one that these women did not answer directly, because answering it directly would have required an acknowledgement that the knowing had been unbearable, and the acknowledgement itself was a form of breaking that the training had made almost impossible. But the evidence, from the letters and the diaries and the recollections of children who observed closely, suggests that there were moments when the private picture became very difficult to carry. Moments when the assembled evidence arrived at a conclusion that could not be managed calmly, that required more than composure to absorb. What happened in those moments was different for different women. Some of them went to the garden, and the garden absorbed it. The physical work of weeding or planting or cutting back provided the body with something to do while the mind processed what it had just concluded, and when they came back inside, an hour later, their hands dirty and the result visible in the beds, they had carried the thing through and were ready to continue. Some of them went to their piano. Some of them went to the church at a quiet time, not for a service, but for the specific quality of silence available in a cold stone building on a Tuesday afternoon, a silence different in character from the silence of the house, impersonal in a way that allowed the personal to be set down for a while. Some of them cried. Not in front of anyone, this was not possible, or was understood to be not possible. They cried in the bath, where the sound was covered and the evidence would be gone by the time the bath was done. They cried in the garden, where no one came at certain hours. They cried in the car, in the few minutes between arriving at their destination and composing themselves to get out. The crying was not a failure. It was the body's own accounting, the acknowledgement the face was not permitted to make being made instead in the private, temporary, completely invisible way that these women had developed for all of their private things. When it was done, they composed themselves and went back to the kitchen or the drawing room or the dinner table and continued. The doctors who treated these women during the difficult years saw a pattern they recognized, without fully understanding the presentation of exhaustion and anxiety in women whose external circumstances appeared stable, whose households appeared to be functioning normally, who described their lives in terms that did not obviously account for the level of distress the body was exhibiting. The doctors prescribed rest and tonics, and in some cases the mild sedatives that were then in common use, and they understood that something in the patient's life was producing the symptoms, but the social conventions that governed the consultation prevented either party from naming it directly. A doctor who had known the family for 20 years understood certain things about the family's situation without having been told them, and he treated the wife accordingly with a particular gentleness, a particular consideration, but the treatment was for the symptoms, not the cause, because the cause was structural and medical treatment was not the instrument for structural causes. There is a particular conversation that appears in several of the surviving accounts from these years, in different forms and in different households, that suggests something important about how the women of this generation communicated their knowledge to each other. The conversation always takes place in a domestic setting, a kitchen, a garden, a drawing room from which the men have gone, and it always proceeds at two levels simultaneously. At the surface level, it is a conversation about the manageable specifics of domestic life, the cost of flour, the difficulty of finding good help, the progress of the kitchen garden. Underneath it is a conversation about the situation, about what each woman knows about her household's position, about how she is managing, about what she is expecting next. The underneath conversation is conducted entirely in the surface language, in the gaps and the emphases and the specific words chosen rather than other words, in the pause before a particular answer. Both women know both conversations are happening. Neither names the lower one. The morning hours before the household was awake were the hours that belonged to these women most completely. In the quiet of the early morning, with the kettle on and the light coming in and the day not yet begun, there was a specific quality of mental clarity that the populated hours did not provide. The thinking that happened in the early morning was different from the thinking that happened during the day, less managed, less performed, less organized around the requirements of the social world. In the early morning, the private picture could be examined directly, the fragments assembled and assessed, the plans made and revised without interruption. This was the operational time, the time when the management of the household's actual situation could be conducted without the concurrent management of the household's presented situation. The two were always in tension. In the early morning, the tension was temporarily resolved in favor of the actual. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. They are not nameless, though history has left most of them in a general kind of anonymity that is itself a form of the silence they practiced. Some of them appear in the peripheral accounts in biographies of their husbands, in the social histories of the towns and cities where these families lived, in the records of charitable organizations they chaired, and the schools where they sat on boards, and the churches where they gave money. From these peripheral appearances, and from the family letters and diaries that have surfaced in the decades since, some of the specific women emerge with enough clarity to be recognized as people, not categories. There was the wife of a Connecticut mill owner whose family had operated 3 textile mills since the 1860s. She was a woman in her mid-40s when the mills closed, one after another, in the years between 1930 and 1934, as the demand for New England textiles collapsed under competition from southern mills and then from imported fabric. Her husband spent most of those 4 years in correspondence with creditors, with the bank, with the lawyers who were managing the dissolution of assets that had seemed solid enough to last forever. She spent those 4 years running the household on an allowance that decreased quarterly and managing the appearance of a family that was still functioning normally, the children in their schools, the church attendance regular, the Christmas party given as always though at 1/3 of its previous scale. She kept a diary in those years, fragments of which have survived. The entries are brief and practical lists of tasks, notes about the household accounts, occasional observations about the weather. What is notable is what is absent. There is no mention of the mills, of the financial crisis, of the husband's state of mind, of her own fear. The diary is a record of the household, not the woman, and it reads as a very deliberate document, practical, focused, contained. One entry, written in the autumn of 1933, when the last mill had closed and the house had been listed for sale, notes that the roses needed cutting back before the first frost. This is the entry. It is about roses. Her daughter, who later gave interviews to a local historian, said that her mother never discussed the family's financial difficulties with the children during this period. The daughter had understood that something was happening. Children always understand this, but had been given no language for it, no framework, no explicit acknowledgement that the life they had known was ending. She remembered her mother's composure as something that had seemed, at the time, reassuring, and which later seemed to her more complicated. The composure had protected the children from anxiety, yes. It had also left them without the information they would have needed to make sense of what happened next, when the house was sold and the family moved to a smaller one, and the servants were gone and the life reorganized entirely. In Philadelphia, in a family that had been in the city since the colonial period, there was a woman whose husband had inherited a banking fortune built on generations of Quaker financial probity. The bank had survived the panic of 1907, the disruptions of the First World War, and the initial shock of 1929. It did not survive 1931, when a wave of bank failures swept through the region and took with it institutions that had seemed, by their age and their reputation, immune to the contemporary disaster. Her husband was not the cause of the failure. He had inherited it and managed it conservatively, as he had been taught to manage it, but he had also not prevented the failure, and the distinction between those two facts, not the cause, not the prevention, was one that he spent the rest of his life trying to hold clearly in his own mind. His wife had been involved in Quaker philanthropy her entire adult life, and the network of relationships that involved gave her access to information and perspectives that other women in her social circle did not have. She knew, through the charitable network, how many families in the city were managing catastrophic financial difficulty, and she understood something that the household perspective alone might not have shown her clearly, that what was happening to her family was happening to a great many families, that the specific causes were specific but the pattern was common, and that what was required was not shame but adaptation. This understanding gave her a certain stability during the crisis that some of the other women lacked. She was not the only one. The silence she practiced was a social practice, not a reflection of isolation. She managed the household with the same precision and economy that the others managed theirs, and she maintained the appearances that the situation required. But underneath the management, there was something steadier, a sense of proportion that came from knowing the larger scale of what had happened, from understanding that the ruin was not personal in the deepest sense, that it was circumstantial, historical, a matter of unfortunate timing in the particular decade in which they had found themselves living. She was unusual in this, though not unique. Some other women in similar situations had access to similar perspectives through different channels, through sisters who had married into families whose economic situations allowed for a broader view, through friendships with women outside their own social class who brought entirely different frameworks to the experience of financial difficulty. What all of these women shared was something that many of the most isolated wives lacked: a sense of context. Context made the silence less absolute. It was still silence, but it was a silence chosen with some understanding of its place in a larger story, rather than a silence that felt like the only possible response to an incomprehensible catastrophe. There was also, in Virginia, a woman whose silence had a different quality than the others, not the silence of protection or of management, but the silence of complicity. Her husband had been managing the family's real estate holdings through the late 1920s in ways that were, as the decade ended and the losses became clear, not entirely legal. The properties had been mortgaged and remortgaged in a pyramid of debt that could only have been sustained if the real estate values had continued to rise. When they fell, the pyramid revealed itself. The creditors were not only banks, they were neighbours, business associates, people who had trusted the family name. She knew. Not the legal details, not the technical mechanisms, but the essential fact that people were being hurt by what her husband had done, that the family's social position was built, in part, on transactions that would not survive scrutiny. She knew this in the particular way that a woman in a marriage knows things about her husband, not from documents but from the accumulated observation of years, from the way he spoke about certain people, from the calls he was not available to take, from the specific quality of his anxiety when certain names came up in conversation. She said nothing. Her silence was not the silence of innocence. It was the silence of a woman who understood that speaking would destroy everything that remained: the reputation, the social standing, the ability of her children to live their adult lives without the shadow of what their father had done. She maintained the appearance of the family with the same precision as the others, but the price of her silence was different. She was protecting not just the family's prosperity but the family's innocence, and she knew the difference, even if she never said so. This is one of the darker forms of the silence that shades into concealment, that crosses the line between private management and active complicity. It is worth naming, even in this context, because the history of these families includes it alongside the more sympathetic forms. The women who maintained silence because they had no other option existed, alongside the women who maintained silence when they did have options, when speaking would have changed things, when the protection they were providing was protecting something that should not have been protected, both were silent. The silence looked the same from the outside. Then there were the women whose silence was simply grief, the most naked form of all. A woman in New England whose husband died in 1933 of what the family and the doctor agreed to call heart failure, and which was also what it was the heart had been under unsustainable pressure for 4 years. The financial disaster compounded by the physical toll of sustained stress, and it had given out on a Wednesday morning in November when he was reading the mail in his study, and she was in the kitchen speaking with the cook about the week's menus. She had known he was not well. She had known for months, perhaps longer, in the way of these things, the colouring, the breath, the particular fatigue of a man whose body was carrying too much. She had said nothing about what she observed, because observation was not the same as diagnosis, and because saying it would have made it real in a different way, and because he was already carrying enough. She had watched him carefully and said nothing, and he had died on a Wednesday morning and she had been in the kitchen. The grief that followed was private, in a way that was almost physical in its containment. There were people to notify, arrangements to be made, the estate to be managed by the lawyers since she had no legal standing to manage it herself. The children had to be told, and she told them, in the direct, composed way of a woman who has been preparing for the conversation without knowing she has been preparing. She received the neighbours and the family friends who came to pay their respects, and she sat in the drawing room and accepted the condolences and the casseroles and the flowers, and she was everything she was supposed to be, dignified, grateful, composed. And then they left, and the house was quiet, and the composure sat in her chest like a stone she could not put down. There was another woman in a smaller city in Ohio whose silence had a different quality than any of the others, not strategic, not protective, but habitual in the deepest sense. So habitual that she herself could not have identified it as silence, because silence requires the awareness of what is not being said, and she had grown up in a family where the particular things she was not saying had simply never been said by anyone. The money had gone through her husband's poor investments over the course of 5 years, steadily, without drama, and she had watched it go with a composure so complete that her own children, in later years, were not sure she had known. She had known. The knowing was simply the air of the house, unexamined because examination had never been modelled for her. Her granddaughter, who became a historian, spent years trying to understand her grandmother from the fragments that remained the letters, the household accounts, the oblique references in the family correspondence of people who had known her. What the granddaughter concluded was not that her grandmother had been passive, but that she had been utterly consistent with herself, with her training, with the world as she had understood it to be. She had not seen an alternative to the silence because no one in her world had offered one. The silence was not a choice she had made. It was the shape of her mind, given to her before she was old enough to question whether a different shape was possible. This is one of the hardest things to hold clearly when thinking about these women. The difference between a silence that was chosen and a silence that was inhabited. The woman who chose the silence had, at some level, assessed the alternatives and found them wanting or impossible, and this made her silence an act of a particular kind, carrying a certain weight of agency even in its constraint. The woman who inhabited the silence without having ever had access to an alternative was in a different situation, a situation in which the silence was not a response to circumstances, but a precondition of them. Both women were silent. They were not the same woman. History has sometimes collapsed them into a single figure, the silent wife, and the collapsing loses something essential about each of them. The letters that these women wrote to each other, when they wrote at all, are archives of a specific kind of oblique communication that rewards very careful reading. A letter from one wife to another in 1932 or 1935, exchanging news of children and household matters and the small events of domestic life, communicates its real content in what it elides. The phrase "a quiet year," used to describe the family's activities, means something specific to a reader who knows what a quiet year looks like in a household that has contracted. The reference to making do with what the garden provides carries information that the words do not say. The inquiry after the correspondent's household, framed as interest rather than concern, is a delicate probe, an offer of the kind of recognition that is the closest these letters can come to explicit acknowledgement. The women who wrote and received these letters were skilled readers of the specific language, and what they communicated to each other, through all the elision, was that they understood each other. The particular woman in New England whose husband died of heart failure in 1933 spent the years after his death in a form of the silence that was different in character from the silence of the crisis years, because the thing she was silent about had changed. In the crisis years, she had been silent about what she knew about the financial situation, about her reading of the trajectory, about her private assessment of what was coming. After his death, she was silent about a different thing, the specific question of what she thought, now that it was over and the account could be examined, had gone wrong, whether the decisions he had made were the decisions that had needed to be made, or whether other decisions had been available, whether the situation had been as impossible as it had looked from inside it, or whether something different advice, a different response to a particular moment, a conversation that could have been had and was not, might have changed the outcome. She never answered this question out loud. She carried it privately for decades. What she told her children, when she told them anything, was that their father had done his best in a very difficult time, which was true in the sense that every charitable assessment of a person is true. It selects the facts that support the conclusion. It was also incomplete, which she knew, and she knew that she knew, and the knowing sat in her in the particular way that things sit in people who have decided, with full awareness, not to say them. Not because they are not true, because the saying is not the right action, because the dead cannot respond, because the living need something different from the truth of what happened than the truth itself can provide. Because the silence, which had been a strategy during the crisis, had become, after the crisis, something else. A form of respect for the complexity of a life that could not be reduced to its outcome. The children in these houses were the unintended audience. They were not supposed to be watching. The performance was not directed at them. It was directed at the social world, outside the house, at the neighbours and guests and tradespeople whose perception of the family's standing had to be maintained. The children were inside the production, backstage, and the assumption was that backstage was not really watching. Children absorbed rather than observed. They felt the atmosphere without analysing it. They grew up inside it and therefore could not see it the way the outside world saw it, or the way they themselves would later see it, at a distance of 20 years. This assumption was wrong. The children were watching. They were watching with the particular attention of people for whom the atmosphere of the house was the entire world, who had no comparison point, who could not yet say this feels unusual because they did not know what usual looked like from the outside. But they were acutely sensitive to the fluctuations of that atmosphere, registering changes in their parents' behaviour with a nervous precision that was, in many cases, far more detailed than anything the parents suspected. The daughters watched the mothers. This was the most specific inheritance, the one that travelled most directly from one generation to the next. A daughter in one of these households during the difficult years was receiving a continuous education in the management of household crisis, whether anyone intended to give her that education or not. She watched her mother move through the reduced household with the same composure she had always brought to the prosperous one. She watched her mother speak to the cook in the kitchen, negotiate with the tradespeople, manage the dinner table with fewer resources and equivalent results. She watched the face that never showed what it knew. What the daughters took from this watching was complex and not uniform. Some of them took a deep respect, an understanding that their mothers had done something genuinely difficult with genuine skill, a respect that deepened as they grew older and understood more clearly what had been required. Some of them took a template, a set of behaviours and responses that they replicated in their own marriages without entirely conscious intention, finding that when their own households faced difficulty, they managed it in the same way their mothers had quietly, internally, without disturbing the surface. Some of them took a rebellion. They looked at the silence their mothers had practiced and understood it as a trap, as the mechanism by which the women of their mother's generation had been contained in impossible positions and had endured those positions without complaint, and they decided, with the clarity of the generation that follows, that they would not do the same. They would speak. They would ask questions about the finances before the crisis arrived. They would have independent knowledge and independent standing, and they would not find themselves, at 50, managing a household crisis alone in silence, because no one had thought to give them access to the information that would have allowed them to help earlier. This rebellion was real, and it produced real change. The daughters who came of age in the 1940s and 1950s, who had watched their mothers through the Depression years, did tend to handle their own marriages differently, not uniformly, not completely, but in ways that were measurably different from the previous generation. More of them maintained separate financial identities. More of them insisted on being informed about the family's financial situation. More of them had conversations about money that their mothers would not have had, could not have had, within the culture of the households they had grown up in. But the rebellion was also incomplete, because the forces that had shaped the mothers were not entirely absent from the daughters' lives. The social world they inherited still valued the composed surface. The legal structures were changing, but slowly. The husbands of the next generation had themselves grown up in households where money was the husband's domain and the domestic life was the wife's. And the habits of mind formed in those households did not disappear simply because the daughters had decided they should. The daughters who insisted on financial transparency sometimes met resistance. The daughters who maintained financial independence were sometimes seen as expressing distrust of their husbands rather than care for themselves. The sons watched the fathers. This was its own education, less documented but equally consequential. The sons in these households during the crisis years were watching men under enormous pressure. men who had inherited something and were failing to preserve it, who were living through the gap between what they had been expected to do and what they were able to do, who were carrying the weight of that gap in the way men in these families had learned to carry things, without showing it, without discussing it, with the same composed surface that the wives were maintaining from their side. What the sons received was a model of masculine distress that was as confined as the feminine model was. The fathers did not speak about what was happening, not to the sons, not in any direct way. They might include an older son in a conversation with the family lawyer, might bring him to a meeting with the banker as a form of initiation, but even these inclusions were managed with a reticence that communicated what they did not say. This is how we handle things. This is the face we present. This is what being a man in this family means. The face we present, not the interior, the face. The sons who inherited distressed estates or diminished inheritances had been given no more preparation for managing the situation than the daughters had, which is to say, they had been given the appearance of preparation without its substance. They had been told what was expected of them, in terms of conduct and character and the maintenance of the family's name. They had not been told, in any practical sense, how to manage financial difficulty, how to recognize when a situation was beyond rescue, how to ask for help, without the asking feeling like an admission of failure that the family's code did not permit. Some of the sons responded to this by replicating the silence, managing the diminished inheritance with the same reticence their fathers had managed the collapse, declining to acknowledge it to their own wives, maintaining the appearances for another generation until there was simply nothing left to maintain. The houses that had belonged to their grandfathers passed through their father's generation and arrived at theirs already compromised, already carrying debts, already reduced in staff and upkeep, and they managed these inherited compromises with the inherited composure and said nothing, and married women who would observe the signals and say nothing, and the silence completed another cycle. Others could not maintain it. The sons who broke the pattern, who acknowledged the situation, who sold the house, who spoke plainly to their wives and their bankers and their children were sometimes seen, within the family and the social world, as having failed in a way that the fathers who had managed the silence had not failed. The acknowledgement was read as defeat. The silence had been read as dignity. Both readings were wrong in important ways, but the social world applied them consistently, and the men who broke the pattern had to live in the social world as well as in the truth. The children of these households carried the experience into their own lives in ways that were not always visible, even to themselves. There was the child who could not speak about money in any context for the rest of her life, who changed the subject when it came up at dinner, who felt a physical anxiety at any explicit discussion of finances, who had absorbed the message that money was dangerous to acknowledge and had metabolized it so deeply that the message operated below consciousness. There was the child who overcompensated by becoming extremely explicit about financial matters in his own household, who told his wife everything, who showed her the accounts, who discussed every significant expenditure before it was made, who had decided that the silence was the thing that had been wrong, and the antidote to silence was complete transparency. And there was the child who had grown up watching and understood, in some way she could not have fully articulated until much later, that what her mother had done was both an act of strength and an act of captivity, that the two things were not separable, that the woman who had kept the household running through the worst years had been running it alone in a way that was heroic and was also unjust, and that the heroism and the injustice were not in competition with each other, but were in fact the same fact seen from two different angles. This child, and she existed in many households, in many variations, grew up to be the grandmother who told the stories, the one who eventually broke the silence of the generation before, who named what had happened and named what it had cost, and gave the grandchildren the information that the children had been denied. She was the bridge between the silence and the understanding, and her telling was its own form of the love that the silence had expressed in a different way. She had watched, and she had understood, and she had waited until it was safe to say what she had seen. The granddaughters who eventually told the stories often reported a specific moment of transition, a point in their own lives when they had faced something difficult and had felt, in the midst of facing it, the presence of what their grandmothers had faced. Not the same circumstances, not the same constraints, not the same silence, but something underneath the circumstances, the specific experience of managing more than is visible, of carrying knowledge that has no official outlet, of doing the interior work of a family's survival in a way that no one tallies and no one credits. In that specific experience, they recognized their grandmothers, recognized them in themselves, and the recognition was the beginning of the story being told. The telling was a form of repair, not repair of the past, which cannot be repaired, but repair of the understanding that had been broken by the silence, the understanding that would have allowed the generations to know each other more fully, to carry the family's real history rather than the performed version, to make use of what the grandmothers had learned in ways that might have spared the granddaughters some of the same lessons. The telling came too late for that. It always comes too late, the intergenerational telling, because it requires the distance of time before it becomes possible, and by the time it is possible, the immediate practical use has passed. But it was still worth telling. Understanding matters even when the understanding cannot change anything. It is its own kind of use. The daughters who had watched their mothers through the difficult years carried specific images that had lodged in memory with a permanence that surprised them in later life. The image of a mother standing at the kitchen window in the early morning with a cup of coffee, looking out at the garden, very still. The image of a mother at the writing desk on a winter afternoon, the lamp on, the pen in hand, not writing. The image of a mother at dinner, listening to a guest's story with full attention, laughing at exactly the right moment, entirely present in the room in a way that gave no indication of what she was present with. These images stayed because they were teaching something, even when the lesson was not named. The memory that children form in households under stress has a particular quality that developmental psychologists have described in various ways, though none of the descriptions quite captures the specific texture of it as it was experienced. The children in these households did not form memories of events, primarily not of the specific moment when the bad news arrived or the specific conversation in which the situation was acknowledged. What they formed were memories of atmosphere, the specific feeling of a household in which the adults were managing something, the quality of attention in a room when two people are present together and one or both of them is preoccupied. These atmospheric memories proved very durable. They survived long past the specific circumstances that produced them, outlasting the houses and the marriages and the specific financial disasters that had created the atmosphere in the first place. The children who had grown up in them carried the atmosphere into their adult lives and recognized it when they encountered it in their own households, recognized it with a precision that startled them, a recognition so specific that it could only have come from very early and very close experience. The grandchildren of these women, when they eventually received the stories, received them in a context that the original women could not have imagined, a context in which the silence was already partially understood as a historical condition, in which the legal and social changes of the intervening decades had made the structural forces that had produced the silence visible in ways they had not been visible from inside the silence itself. The grandchildren could name what the grandmothers had not been able to name, could locate the silence in the specific historical moment that had made it necessary, could see the constraints as constraints, rather than as the natural order of things. This naming and locating was useful. It was also slightly distancing, because it made the grandmothers into figures of a particular historical moment, rather than simply people. And people are always more than the historical moment that constrained them. The daughters who chose not to replicate their mother's silence did so at a cost that was different from the cost of replicating it. They had the conversations that their mothers had not been able to have, asked the questions that their mothers had not been permitted to ask, insisted on access to the family's financial information in ways that sometimes produced resistance and sometimes produced relief. The relief was the husband's as much as the wife's, the relief of not carrying the knowledge alone, of having someone to share the weight with, of having the private acknowledged in the private domain of the marriage. Not all marriages could sustain this. Some had been built on the division, and the division was structural, and removing it was not simply removing a convention but removing a load-bearing wall. But some marriages were stronger for it, and the strength was the strength that comes from two people actually sharing a life rather than managing adjacent performances of a shared life. The neighbours saw the house. They saw the shutters that were kept painted, the garden that was maintained, the car in the drive, the family coming out on Sunday morning in clothes that were correct. They saw the curtains drawn at night, and the lights moving from room to room in the pattern of an ordinary evening. They saw the wife at the charity meeting, composed and engaged, her contribution of time, if not money, still consistent with her family's standing. They saw the children walking to school. They saw, in short, the surface, and the surface told a story of continuation, of a family managing its life as it had always managed it, of nothing unusual in progress. This was exactly what was intended. The maintenance of the surface was not accidental. It was the result of daily effort, of decisions made before dawn about how the household would present itself, of a kind of choreography so practiced it had become natural. The wife who kept the surface intact was not performing unconsciously. She was performing deliberately, with full knowledge of what the performance concealed, and she was performing it for the neighbours and the social world, because the social world was the medium in which the family's standing existed, and the family's standing was still worth protecting for as long as it could be. Protected. What the neighbours did not see was the morning before the Sunday. The wife, who had been up since 5:30 because sleep had not been possible, moving quietly through the kitchen to make coffee and organise the day before anyone else was awake. The coat that had been carefully pressed and brushed the night before to extend its life another season. The conversation with the cook, 10 minutes before the family came down for breakfast, in which menus for the week were planned around what was in the garden and what was in the larder and what the household account could support this week specifically. The small, careful calculations of a household running at the edge of its means, conducted in the domestic spaces that the neighbours never entered. The charity meetings were their own kind of concealment. The wives of these families had been active in charitable organisations throughout their marriages. This was a social obligation as well as a genuine commitment, and in many cases the commitment was real, the engagement not merely performative. But during the years of difficulty, the charity meetings served an additional function. They were the social space in which the wife continued to exist as a person of standing, continued to exercise judgment and leadership, and be treated as someone whose opinion carried weight, at exactly the time when her position in her own household was most precarious. This was not nothing. In a period when her financial standing was eroding, when her domestic world was under constant pressure, when her private life required the continuous application of skills that no one was acknowledging or crediting, the charity meeting was a space where she was competent and recognised and able to contribute in ways that were visible. She was good at the work, good at organising, at negotiating between competing interests, at managing the social dynamics of a committee of women who had their own hierarchies and their own ambitions. The skills were the same skills she applied at home, but here they were acknowledged as skills. The social world around these families in the crisis years was itself full of people managing similar situations in similar silence, and there was a quality of mutual recognition that occasionally broke through the surface. Two women at a charity meeting who both understood, from the signs that neither acknowledged, that the other's household was in difficulty, who never said this directly, who would not have said it directly, but who managed the relationship with a particular care, a particular consideration, that was different in quality from their relationships with people in easier circumstances, a kind of solidarity conducted entirely in the subtext. This silent solidarity was real and it mattered, even if it never produced the explicit conversation that might have been most useful. The knowledge that others understood, even without speaking it, was a form of company in the loneliness of the situation. It did not solve anything. It did not provide financial assistance or practical counsel, or the emotional relief of being able to say out loud what was happening. But it provided the small comfort of not being entirely alone in the performance, of knowing that across the room another woman was managing her own version of the same choreography, and understanding it, and choosing not to expose it, because that was what they both needed the other to choose. The domestic staff who remained in these households saw considerably more than the neighbours did, and this created a particular kind of vulnerability that the wives were acutely aware of and managed with great care. The cook who had worked in the household for 15 years, who had seen the table in its full prosperity, and was now planning menus around the kitchen garden, understood exactly what the reduced household meant. The single maid who was now doing the work of 3 knew that the household had contracted. The gardener who came 2 days a week instead of 5 knew what the full week had looked like. These were people whose discretion was essential to the household's survival, and the wife understood this. She managed the relationships with the remaining staff not just as an employer, but as a person who needed specifically their silence as well as their labour. The management was delicate. It required maintaining the staff's confidence and goodwill, their sense that the household was still worth working in, that they were still valued, that their own situations were as secure as could be managed, while also depending on their professional discretion about what they observed. The staff were not unaware of what was being asked of them, and the good ones, the ones who stayed, had their own reasons for maintaining the silence. Some of them stayed out of loyalty, a real attachment to the family developed over years of close domestic proximity. Some stayed because their own situations made the reduced wage of a declining household preferable to the uncertainty of seeking work elsewhere, especially in the Depression years when domestic service positions were competed for by far more applicants than there were positions to fill. Some stayed because they understood, with the pragmatic realism of people who had always worked for money, that the family's current difficulty was not necessarily permanent, that households had recovered from difficulty before and might recover again, and that a reputation for loyalty in difficult times would be rewarded in better ones. The relationships formed in these diminished households between the wives and the remaining staff had a different quality than the relationships of the prosperous years. Less formal in some ways, the distance maintained by staffing levels dissolves when there is only one person on either side of the divide. More honest, in others, the necessity of discussing the household's actual situation with the cook, even obliquely, produced a working relationship of greater transparency than the years of abundance had required. The wife who was managing the household with real skill in genuinely difficult circumstances was visible to the cook in a way she had not been when her management had consisted primarily of choosing between options that all lay within comfortable range. The neighbours, the charity committees, the social world. They saw the surface and drew their conclusions from the surface. The conclusions were not always wrong. Some families managed their difficulties and recovered. Some extended the performance long enough to find their way to genuine stability through changed circumstances. An inheritance that arrived, a business that turned, the slow economic recovery of the late 1930s that provided real ground under feet that had been treading water for most of the decade. For these families, the silence had served its purpose. The time purchased by the performance had been time enough. For others, the conclusions drawn from the surface were wrong. The performance outlasted its justification. The families continued to look like what they had been after they had ceased to be it, continued to maintain the appearances beyond the point where the appearances were protecting anything that could be recovered, because the habit of maintenance was stronger than the moment of acknowledgement, because the women who were maintaining it could see no safe moment to stop, because stopping looked like the end and the end had not yet been faced. In these families, the crisis that finally became public was often worse for the delay. The years of maintained appearances had consumed assets that might have provided a softer landing. The debts that had been managed around rather than addressed had accumulated interest. The relationships with creditors who had been kept at bay through continued good conduct had not been converted into the renegotiations that might have provided room to manoeuvre. The household that finally acknowledged the crisis often did so in a more devastating form than the one that might have been managed earlier, if anyone had been in a position to manage it. The neighbours saw this too, eventually, and processed it with the same composure that the household had been modelling for them, with the social grace of people who understood that the correct response to a family's difficulty was a certain discretion, a period of not seeing, and then, when the difficulty was formally acknowledged, a response of sympathy expressed at the correct level of warmth, neither so much that it embarrassed nor so little that it failed to convey the solidarity of the social world. They had learned from the same culture that had taught the women. They too had been trained in the art of the surface. What the world outside did not see was also what it did not look for, because the world outside had its own reasons to prefer the performance to the reality. The neighbours who maintained the comfortable fiction that everything was fine were not only protecting the family in question, they were also protecting themselves from the implications of the alternative. If a family of this kind could fall, a family with this history, this house, this standing, then the ground under their own feet was less solid than they had preferred to believe. The fiction was mutual. The performance was mutually maintained. The silence was a social contract to which all parties were signatories, even those who never knew they had signed. The social world of the period had been built on certain assumptions about the permanence of established position, assumptions that the economic disasters of the middle century were disproving. The established families were not supposed to fall. They had been established, which meant settled, fixed, permanent in the way that the features of a landscape are permanent. They might weather slightly over centuries, but they would not disappear. The discovery that they could disappear, that they were disappearing, was not comfortable for anyone who had built their own understanding of the world on the assumption of their permanence. This was why the social world maintained the performances long past the point where the performers themselves believed in them. It was not only protecting the declining families, it was protecting its own sense of how the world worked. A social world that acknowledged the collapse of old money would have to reckon with what that collapse meant for the values the old money had represented. Values of stability, continuity, the permanence of the properly established. The silence was easier than the reckoning. It was chosen collectively by everyone involved, and the women who maintained it were doing the work that the social world had agreed, without discussion, needed to be done. The charitable organizations that many of these women chaired or served on the boards of were, in these years, among the most socially important institutions in their communities, and their importance had increased precisely because of the Depression. Because the need for charitable work was so much greater, the stakes of the work so much higher, the community's dependence on organized charity so much more visible. A woman who continued to chair the relief committee, who continued to organize the distribution of food and clothing and the coordination of services for families in genuine destitution, was doing work that mattered in ways that her own household social function did not. The work provided a context in which her competence was acknowledged, her judgment trusted, her contributions valued for their real content rather than for what they signified about the family's standing. This was different from social entertaining. It was real. The towns where many of these families lived were small enough that the maintenance of appearances was both more necessary and more difficult than it would have been in a large city. In a small town, everyone knew approximately how everyone else lived. The size of the household staff was visible. The condition of the house was observable from the street. The frequency and scale of the entertaining was known to the network of people who were either invited or aware of not being invited. The privacy that a large city permits through simple anonymity was not available. Everything was more observed, which meant that everything had to be more managed, which meant that the wife's work of maintenance was more continuous and more precise. The minister knew, the doctor knew, the people who ran the businesses where the family had accounts knew, in the general way that people who extend credit know things about the people they extend it to. The postmistress, in the smaller towns, knew which envelopes came from which financial institutions and with what frequency, because the mail passed through her hands and she had the memory and the attention that her position required. None of these people spoke about what they knew, because the same social conventions that governed the wife governed everyone in the community. The conventions of discretion, of not naming what had not been named, of maintaining the social surface that allowed everyone to continue to function in the same space, without the friction that explicit acknowledgement would create. The community's silence and the wife's silence were the same silence, extended across all the people who had reason to know and had agreed, without discussion, not to say. What the social world outside these households also did not see was the specific form of dignity that was being practiced inside them. Dignity is a word with several meanings, and the one being practiced here was not the dignity of status or position. That dignity was precisely what was under threat. It was the dignity of self-possession, the maintenance of a coherent, intentional self through circumstances that were doing everything in their power to dissolve that coherence. The woman who continued to manage her household with care and attention, who continued to present herself to the world with composure, who continued to meet the social obligations of her position, even as the position was diminishing. This woman was practicing a form of dignity that had nothing to do with the fortune that had been attached to it. The dignity was hers. It was portable. It survived the fortune. The objects in these households spoke, not in the way that objects speak in fairy tales, not with voices, not with messages, but in the quiet way that accumulated things communicate the life that has been lived around them, the choices that were made, the people who are here and are now somewhere else. The wives who managed these households over decades had assembled, or inherited, or received as gifts, collections of objects that held the family's history in a particular way, not as archive, but as atmosphere. The presence of the past made tangible in the silver on the sideboard, the china in the cabinet, the books on the library shelves. The silver. The silver deserves particular attention because in these households it was among the most significant objects in the domestic world, and its presence and condition communicated more than most objects did. Old money households had silver that had come down through the family, not just spoons and forks, but the serving pieces, the tea service, the candelabras, the trays, the small decorative pieces that sat on surfaces and caught the light. The silver had been given as wedding gifts and as christening gifts and as anniversary gifts, and had been polished by generations of housemaids, and was now polished, in the difficult years, by the wife herself, or by the single remaining maid, or occasionally by the wife and the maid together, on Thursday mornings when the social calendar for the week had been fixed, and there was a defined space in the morning for the task. Polishing silver is meditative work. It requires attention without creativity. The cloth, the polish, the circular motion, the gradual emergence of the surface from tarnish into brilliance. It gives the hands something to do while the mind moves freely, and in the difficult years the minds of the women polishing the silver had a great deal of material to move through. The task had its own rhythm, and the rhythm was perhaps useful, not therapeutic in the clinical sense but serviceable, the physical occupation of the hands providing something to organize the body around while the thoughts did what they needed to do. The silver did not diminish. This was one of its uses in the difficult years. It was a form of visual prosperity that cost nothing to maintain except the labour of maintenance. A table set with the family's silver looked like a table in a prosperous house, because silver of this quality in this age was associated correctly with the prosperity that had purchased it over generations. The guests who came to dinner saw the silver and drew conclusions from it that were no longer entirely accurate, and the wife who set it out understood this, and set it out with the same care she had always brought to the task, and said nothing. The china cabinet was a similar repository of continuity. The good china, the set used for company, the one that matched throughout, the one brought out for the dinners that the household continued to give, carried the family's social identity in a specific way. A woman in one of these households could tell you which pieces of the set had been broken over the decades and replaced, and which replacement pieces were close but not quite matching, and which ones had come down from her mother-in-law and were slightly older than the rest of the set, and distinguishable to the trained eye by a very slight variation in the glaze. These were things she knew as intimate facts, the way she knew the faces of her children, not as information filed away but as knowledge that was simply present, that required no retrieval because it had never been stored, only accumulated. The books were different from the silver and the china. The books communicated intellectual life and aspiration in addition to prosperity, and in the difficult years they were sometimes among the first things to go, not in dramatic sales, not announced, but in the quiet ways that households shed things when they are contracting. A shelf that had held 4 volumes of a set now held 3, and then 2, and eventually 1, and no one remarked on the absences because it would have required looking closely, and looking closely at surfaces was something the social world had been trained not to do. Some of the books went to second-hand dealers, the transactions handled with the same discretion applied to the jewellery disposals. A trip to a dealer in a town far enough away that the transaction was unlikely to become social knowledge. The books that were sold were not the family's books exactly, not the ones with inscriptions, not the ones that had been given as Christmas presents, or that bore the marks of particular readings. Those were kept. What was sold was the excess, the multiple copies, the volumes in series where 1 or 2 were sufficient, the decorative sets that had been bought by the yard and never read. The furniture made its own kind of statement, and its condition was one of the things the wife monitored with particular attention. Old furniture, well-made furniture, does not require replacement if it is maintained, and the furniture in these households was old and well-made, and had been maintained by the generations of servants who had polished it, and moved it carefully and repaired its small injuries before they became large ones. But maintenance deferred accumulates, and in the households where the economy had extended to the deferral of furniture maintenance, the signs eventually appeared. A wobble in a chair leg that had not been there before, a crack in a veneer that had begun as a hairline and was now visible, a surface scratching that would have been addressed in the prosperous years, and was now left because the craftsman who would have addressed it was a luxury the household could no longer afford. The wife watched these small deteriorations with the same attention she brought to everything else, cataloguing them, assessing their visibility, determining which would be noticed by a visitor and which would pass unobserved. She managed the guest traffic through the house with this in mind. Certain rooms were used for entertaining and certain rooms were not, and the distinction was partly a matter of which rooms were in condition to be shown and which were not. The library with the crack in the veneer was not a room for company. The drawing room with its furniture intact was. The beds were a private economy. The linen, as noted before, was maintained. The appearance of the bed was important to the person sleeping in it, and to the domestic standard the wife held for herself, whatever was happening elsewhere. But the quality of the linen was another matter, and the linen closet in these households told its own story. The household had been set up with linen purchased in the prosperous years, fine linen from department stores or from Ireland, or from the domestic linen section of the best shops, and this linen had been laundered and pressed and folded in a way that represented its own category of domestic skill. Over years of use the fine linen wore, and the worn pieces were retired and replaced, and in the prosperous years the replacements were equal to the originals, and in the difficult years the replacements were not, and the linen closet slowly filled with a mixture of the original fine things and their more modest successors, a stratification that was visible to anyone who opened the closet door but visible to no one else. The jewellery was the most complex object story of all. The wife's personal jewellery was, as noted, one of the few assets in the household that was legally hers, and this gave it a significance beyond its aesthetic value. The pieces she wore were the pieces she had decided to keep, and the kept pieces were themselves a statement of what she valued most, of what the family's history meant to her, of what she wanted to carry forward. The small, everyday pieces she wore were often the ones with the most personal meaning. A pin that had been her mother's, a bracelet from a particular anniversary, a strand of pearls that had been given on a particular occasion, and that she wore not for their monetary value but for their connection to a specific moment that mattered. These pieces were not the most monetarily valuable things she owned, or had owned before the disposals, but they were the most truly hers, the ones she had not been able to sell and had not wanted to sell, the ones that sat differently on the body than the more ostentatious pieces had, not as display, not as the performance of prosperity, but as private record, the jewellery as diary. She wore them to charity meetings and to dinners and to church, and they communicated something specific to people who knew her well enough to have seen them always. That this woman, in this diminished household, was still continuous with the woman she had been, was still the same person she had always been in the ways that mattered most to her. The objects did not betray the household. They held its secrets as faithfully as the wife did, carrying the history of prosperity without announcing the current state of things to anyone who was not already looking carefully. This was the function of objects in houses of this kind, to hold the past in the present, to provide the visual vocabulary of a life that had been lived at a certain level, to maintain the atmosphere of continuity even when continuity was under strain. The wife understood this, managed it, used it. She was not sentimental about objects in a way that prevented practical thinking about them. She was clear-eyed about what each thing was worth, and what it communicated, and whether it was earning its keep in the household's economy of appearances. What she allowed herself to keep, she kept for reasons she knew. Reasons of feeling sometimes, reasons of history, reasons of the specific person she intended to remain regardless of what was happening around her. The objects that stayed were the ones that told the truth about who she was. Not about where she stood in the social world, not about what the family's fortune looked like this year, but about who she actually was, what she actually valued, what she would carry with her regardless of what was shed. There was also, in many of these households, the particular economy of clothing, an economy that was conducted with as much skill and discretion as the economy of the table, and that required an equally sophisticated management of appearances. The wife's wardrobe had been built in the prosperous years, and the pieces it contained were of genuine quality. Well-made garments that had been purchased from the right establishments, that fit correctly and wore correctly and communicated, to the eye that knew how to read them, the standard of the household that had produced them. These garments did not become less good because the household had diminished. They were the same garments. They could continue to do their work. The skill was in the maintenance and the rotation. A coat that was cleaned and pressed after each wearing lasted 3 times as long as a coat that was not. A dress that was carefully repaired at the first sign of wear, rather than at the point of visible damage, could be presented indefinitely without its history being apparent. The wife who managed this knew which pieces were available for which occasions, knew the rotation that would preserve each piece longest, knew the specific repairs that needed to be made and made them herself or had them made quietly. The wardrobe was not diminished. It was curated, managed with an attention that the prosperous years had not required, because the prosperous years had simply allowed for replacement. The jewellery, as noted, was its own economy, separate from the wardrobe but related to it. The accessories that completed the presentation, the pieces that communicated the family's history as clearly as the house did. A woman who appeared at dinner in a dress from 5 seasons past, and the pearls that had been her mother's wedding gift, was making a statement that was readable by people who understood how these statements were made. That the pearls mattered, that the dress was appropriate, that the combination was correct, that the whole presentation was deliberate and confident. The confidence was real. It required effort to maintain, but it was real, rooted in the woman's own assessment of what she had and what it was worth. The photograph albums that survive from these households are another form of the surface, the curated visual record that the families chose to maintain as their own history. The photographs show what photographs always show: the posed moments, the dressed occasions, the family assembled in its Sunday presentation for the camera's judgment. They show the houses looking well, the gardens in their summer fullness, the children in their school clothes or their party clothes, the adults in the good years and the difficult years indistinguishable from each other, because both years were presented with the same deliberate composure. What the photographs do not show is what the albums were composed alongside: the discussions with the lawyer, the conversation with the cook about next week's menus, the morning calculation over the household account. The album and the reality sat on the same shelf, in the same house, maintained by the same woman, as different from each other as two things could be while sharing the same address. The books in the library included in many of these households volumes of household management from earlier decades, guides to domestic economy, to the management of a house of a certain size, to the planning of menus and the supervision of staff. These books had been purchased in the prosperous years as reference materials, and had sat on their shelves largely unread, because the household had been managed by people who knew how to manage it without needing to consult a book. In the difficult years they were taken down and read, carefully by women who were discovering that they needed to know things the books could tell them. Things about the efficient use of a limited kitchen larder, about the maintenance of textiles to extend their life, about the organisation of household labour when the labour was entirely her own. The books were imperfect guides, written for larger establishments with more staff than now existed anywhere, but they were something, and the women who read them were discovering a literature of domestic competence that their own education had not made available to them. The end of the silence, when it came in different forms for different families. For some, it came through the formal mechanism of insolvency, the moment when the legal structures of debt and asset had been exhausted, when the lawyers gathered and the documents were signed and the house was listed for sale, and the facts that had been managed for years were now a matter of public record. This was not a moment of relief exactly, though some of the women who passed through it described something close to relief afterward, a heaviness lifting. The exhaustion of the performance suddenly ended, the strange freedom of no longer needing to maintain something that had already been lost. For others, the end came gradually, through a process of reorganisation that was less catastrophic than total insolvency, but equally permanent in its alteration of the family's life. The house that was too large and too expensive was exchanged for a smaller one in a neighbourhood that was respectable but less conspicuous. The staff was reduced to nothing, and then perhaps, in time, to a cleaner 2 days a week, and the wife who had managed a household of 8 found herself managing a household of 2 or 3 in rooms that she kept herself, with a competence that was hard-won and genuine and unacknowledged by anyone except herself. The smaller house was, for many of these women, a revelation of a specific kind. The things they had believed were essential, the staff, the scale, the social infrastructure of entertaining at the level they had always entertained, turned out to be, in practice, not essential. The smaller house could be kept beautifully. A dinner for 6 could be as good as a dinner for 16, and required a fraction of the anxiety. The garden, if there was one, could be managed by one person with genuine pleasure, without the formality that size and expectation had previously required. The life that emerged from the smaller house was, in many cases, quieter and more real than the life that had been lived in the larger one. This is not to romanticize the reduction. The reduction was not chosen and was not welcomed, and the loss was real and was felt. The house that had been the family home for 20 years, where the children had been born and raised, where the parties had been given and the christenings celebrated and the ordinary evenings passed. The loss of that house was a genuine loss, and the grief of it was not something that smaller rooms and a quieter life could entirely compensate. Some of the women carried the loss of the house as a permanent wound. Some dreamed of it for years. Some never stopped comparing the smaller house to the one that had preceded it. But the loss was also, in some cases, a clarification. The performance that had been required in the large house, the maintenance of its scale, its staff, its social function, had consumed a great deal of energy and intelligence and emotional resource that was now available for other things. The wife who had spent a decade managing the gap between what the house required and what the household could afford found, in the smaller house, that she was no longer managing a gap. The new scale was the actual scale. The life being lived was the actual life. There was something in that alignment, between the visible surface and the invisible reality, that was deeply restoring even in the midst of grief. The social reclassification that followed the public acknowledgement of the family's changed circumstances was painful in specific ways that the women had anticipated, and in specific ways they had not. The anticipated pain was the loss of certain social relationships that had been maintained at some level by the family's standing, the friendships that had been partly strategic, the invitations that had been offered because of the family's position, rather than because of genuine warmth. These fell away as expected, and the falling away was painful but not surprising. It confirmed what the wives had suspected all along, that a portion of the social world they had maintained was not real, in the sense of being based on genuine connection, and its absence was the loss of something that had always been partly fiction. The unanticipated pain came from the friendships that survived the reclassification, the people who continued to invite and to visit and to include, who did so without any noticeable change in their manner, who treated the family as what it had always been in the ways that mattered, who made no reference to the changed circumstances and asked for no acknowledgement of them. These people were a revelation. The wife who discovered, in the aftermath of the public acknowledgement, that she had real friends, friends whose connection to her was independent of the house and the silver and the dinner table, experienced something she had not expected to feel in the middle of difficulty. Gratitude of a specific and clarifying kind. The relationship with the husband in the aftermath was its own terrain. For some couples, the shared experience of difficulty and loss had deepened the marriage, had stripped away the social scaffolding that had always surrounded it, and left, underneath the scaffolding, a connection that was more solid than either of them had known was there. The shared management of the crisis, even if that management had been unequal, even if one partner had carried more of it than the other, had created an intimacy of the specific kind that only shared hardship creates. They knew something about each other now that the prosperous years had not required them to know. For other couples, the end of the performance revealed that the performance had been the substance. The house and the dinners and the social round had been the marriage, or a significant part of it, and without those structures the relationship between the two people was thinner than either had wanted to discover. The conversations that had always been conversations about the household, the children, the social calendar, these conversations were now conversations about different things, domestic things, the small daily business of the smaller life, and sometimes these conversations discovered that there was not much else to say, not hostility, not the dramatic collapse of feeling, something quieter and sadder, the recognition that two people had been married to a life, and the life had ended, and what remained was a smaller thing. The children, grown or nearly grown by the time the formal end came in most of these families, processed the change through the frameworks that their upbringing had given them, which is to say through the composure that had been modelled for them, and through the particular quality of silence that had been their household's atmosphere. They did not, as a rule, ask the questions that might have been asked, about what exactly had happened, about the decisions that had led to the situation, about whether anything could have been done differently. These questions were not asked partly because they were not encouraged, and partly because the answers might have required a kind of assessment of the parents that the culture of the household had not prepared them to make. They asked the questions later. Some of them asked in middle age when they were managing their own households and could begin to understand from the inside what their mothers had managed. Some asked as they aged further, when the parents were gone and the family papers sometimes surfaced in estate sales and attics, when the diaries and the letters provided fragments of a picture that had never been drawn for them directly. The questions came slowly, and so did the understanding, a gradual assembly of the evidence into something like a coherent account of what had happened and what it had meant to the people who had been inside it. The understanding that assembled itself over time was not simple. It was not a story of victimhood, because the women in these households had not experienced themselves as victims, or not only as victims, or not without complication. It was not a story of heroism exactly, because heroism implies a choice that many of these women had not had. It was a story of people managing an impossible situation, as well as they could manage it within the tools and the options that their particular moment in history had given them, and managing it in silence because the silence was also genuinely a tool, imperfect, costly, sometimes wrong, but real. What the world sees when it looks at the old money wives who watched their husbands lose everything and said nothing is a picture that is easy to misread. The silence can look like passivity, like the acceptance of a secondary role by women who did not know they deserved more. It can look like complicity in the performance of prosperity, as though the wives were deceiving the social world for their own benefit. It can look like weakness, or it can look like the kind of strength that is indistinguishable from endurance, that requires no dramatic act and produces no dramatic outcome, and is therefore difficult to see clearly. What it actually was, in most cases, was a form of intelligence applied to a situation it could not resolve. With precision and thoroughness and a daily recommitment to the effort that no one was watching, and no one was acknowledging, and no one was thanking anyone for. The silence was not emptiness, it was full of the knowledge assembled from fragments, the calculations made in the quiet of the early morning, the grief metabolized in private so that it did not contaminate the composed surface, the love for the husband and the children and the house, and underneath all of it the persistent, patient hope that time would change the things that knowledge could not. Some of the women, in the years after the formal acknowledgement of the change, discovered that what they had practiced in the silence had prepared them for the aftermath in ways they had not anticipated. The skill of managing on reduced resources, of finding the real beneath the performance, of sustaining relationships through difficulty. These were not small skills. They were precisely the skills required for the smaller life, for the years of genuine recovery, for the cultivation of the real connections that the social world of the prosperous years had sometimes obscured. The difficulty had been a different kind of education, as thorough in its own way as the formal education of the schools. The relationship with money changed for many of these women in the aftermath. The women who had spent the difficult years managing around financial information they were not permitted to access often emerged from the experience with a determination, expressed or unexpressed, to know more. Some of them asked directly for the first time to see the household accounts in full. Some of them began for the first time to manage independent finances. The household account that had always been hers to manage, now managed with full awareness of what was behind it, what funded it, what the constraints were. The knowledge was not comfortable. It was not supposed to be comfortable. It was supposed to be true. The truth was better than the managed performance of the truth, and this was perhaps the clearest lesson that emerged from the long years of silence. The performance had been necessary, or had seemed necessary, or had at least been the only tool available. But it had also prevented the kind of shared management that might have changed something, at the margin, in the outcome. Not changed everything. The structural forces of the Depression were not addressable by any single household's management decisions, but the sharing of the burden, if it had been possible, would have been better for both people. The silence had protected the performance. It had not protected the marriage from the weight of carrying the knowledge alone. The question of what it meant to succeed in this situation is worth asking directly, even though the answer is not simple. Success in the sense of preventing the financial collapse was, in most of these families, not possible. The forces producing the collapse were larger than any household management could address. But success in the sense of maintaining the household through the collapse, of preserving the family as a functioning unit, of keeping the children in their schools and the relationships intact and the passage to the smaller life made with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed, this kind of success was genuinely achievable, and many of the women achieved it. The achievement was not celebrated. It was not acknowledged. It was simply the outcome. The family still together, the children grown and launched, the marriage still standing, the smaller house still home. The outcome was the acknowledgement, even if no one said so. The years immediately following the formal acknowledgement of the family's changed circumstances were often the most difficult in a way that was different from the difficulty of the crisis years. During the crisis, the difficulty had been internal, the knowledge held private, the management conducted alone, the surface maintained against the evidence. After the acknowledgement, the difficulty was external, the changed social position visible, the reclassification underway, the responses of the social world arriving in ways that confirmed or confounded what had been feared. The crisis had been private, the aftermath was public, and the composure required for the public aftermath was, in some ways, harder than the composure required for the private crisis, because the public aftermath had an audience that included people whose responses were not predictable and not entirely within the wife's ability to manage. The smaller house had its own compensations that took time to discover and longer to acknowledge. The rooms that were heated completely, because there were fewer of them. The food that appeared on the table was food that had been thought about and prepared with attention, because there was no longer the buffer of a larger kitchen operation that could absorb inattention. The evenings were quieter, which meant they were more honest. The two people in the drawing room were there because they had chosen to be, not because the social machinery of the larger household had deposited them there. In the smaller house, choices were visible in ways they had not been in the larger one. Everything that remained had been decided to remain. The silence did not end with the generation that practiced it. This is the thing about inherited patterns of behavior. They are not simply discarded when circumstances change, even when the change is as dramatic as the shift in women's legal standing and social position that occurred across the middle decades of the 20th century. The silence had been woven into the fabric of these families at a level below the legal, below the social, in the cellular tissue of what it meant to be a woman in this particular tradition. It passed to the next generation not as instruction but as air, breathed in, taken for granted, present in the atmosphere without ever being named. The daughters who had decided consciously to do things differently than their mothers had done them, to speak, to ask, to insist on access to the information that their mothers had been denied, found that the decision required continuous reinforcement. The habit of not speaking about money ran deep. The trained reflex of the composed surface, the face that received news without flinching, the voice that continued at its previous register, regardless of what had just been said. These were not things that a decision to speak plainly could simply override. They were in the body, in the responses that preceded conscious thought, in the reflexes formed by 1,000 small moments of training that had happened before the decision to be different was possible. This meant that even the daughters who changed behaved differently in some situations than they intended. The conversation with the husband about the household finances could be had. They had decided to have it, they had it. But it was had in a particular way, with the composed face and the level voice, because those were the tools they had for difficult conversations. The composed face was not deception. It was the interface through which they communicated, and they could not always tell from inside it whether it was serving them or serving the old silence in a new form. The daughters also passed things to their own daughters, not always the same things and not always in the same form, but connected to the original by a thread that was sometimes very clear and sometimes very faint. The granddaughters of the women who had watched the Depression-era disasters grew up in households that were already partially reformed, where money was discussed more openly, where the wife's role in financial decision-making was more explicitly recognized, where the composed surface was somewhat less absolute. But the granddaughters still absorbed, through the atmosphere of their childhoods, something of the original training, the sense that certain things were handled privately, that discretion was a virtue, that the household's interior life had a different character from its presented surface. They absorbed, too, the specific quality of female competence that their grandmothers had developed and refined through the difficult years, the competence at domestic management, at reading social atmospheres, at maintaining the surface while managing the interior. This competence was passed down not as a limitation but as a resource, a set of capabilities that were real and useful, even in circumstances far different from the ones that had developed them. The granddaughter who could manage a household through a difficult period, who could plan menus under constraint and maintain relationships under stress, and keep the family's social life functioning through whatever was happening privately. This granddaughter had received something genuinely valuable, even if the context in which it had been forged was one she would not have chosen. What she had also received, and what required more careful examination, was the specific relationship between women and money that the original silence had encoded. The sense that financial matters were primarily the husband's domain, the reflexive discomfort with asking direct questions about money, the trained preference for managing around a financial difficulty rather than confronting it directly, the sense that her own needs and interests in financial matters were secondary to the household's collective presentation. These were patterns that the legal changes of the 20th century had made unnecessary, but law and custom do not change at the same pace, and the customs encoded in family atmosphere outlasted the laws that had initially made them necessary. Some of the granddaughters recognized these patterns in themselves with some alarm and worked specifically to address them, through therapy, through education, through the conscious construction of different habits in their own marriages and households. The recognition was itself the difficult work because the patterns were not experienced as patterns from inside them. They were experienced as the way things were, the natural shape of a marriage, the obvious response to a given situation. Seeing them as inherited choices rather than natural facts required a perspective that was not easy to come by from inside the tradition. Others did not recognize the patterns, or recognized them without finding them problematic, or found them comfortable. The familiar organization of a domestic world that felt right because it resembled the world they had grown up in. There is nothing necessarily wrong with this. A woman who chooses to manage her household in a way that echoes her grandmother's management, who finds satisfaction in those domestic competences, who maintains a composed surface as a genuine expression of her character rather than a defensive strategy. This woman is not imprisoned in her grandmother's silence. She's living her own life in continuity with the tradition, and the tradition is not only about what it cost the women who carried it, it is also about what those women built. The difficulty is in the distinction between the chosen and the unchosen, and that distinction is not always clear. A woman who prefers not to discuss money in certain social contexts, is she expressing her own genuine preference, or is she expressing an inherited anxiety that has been mistaken for preference? A woman who manages her household's financial difficulties quietly, without burdening her social circle with the details, is she exercising appropriate discretion, or is she replicating a silence that her grandmother could not have chosen to break? These questions do not have universal answers. They require the kind of self-examination that the original silence was specifically designed to avoid. The men in these families inherited their own versions of the pattern, the sons who had watched their fathers manage financial crisis in the traditional way, silently, stoically, without asking for help, without acknowledging difficulty until the difficulty was beyond denial, had received a model of masculine financial management that was as constraining as the feminine model, and perhaps more dangerous, because the constraints fell on the person who was legally responsible for making the decisions. The silence that a father maintained about the family's financial difficulties was a silence that prevented the intervention of people who might have helped. The stoicism that prevented a man from consulting his banker earlier, from acknowledging the situation to his wife sooner, from seeking the advice of friends who had managed similar situations. This was not an expression of strength. It was the form that weakness took in the tradition he had inherited. The sons who broke this pattern often did so through genuine crisis, through the experience of watching their own households approach the edge, through the recognition that the tools they had inherited were insufficient, through the humbling encounter with the limits of what silence and stoicism could accomplish, when the situation was structural rather than temporary. These men discovered, sometimes late, that asking for help was not the failure the tradition had insisted it was, that the people they asked, the bankers and lawyers and friends, had seen similar situations before and had counsel to offer that was more useful than the pride of not having asked. The silence of the old money wives was not just the story of a generation or a class. It was the story of what happens when a culture assigns specific domains to specific people and then constructs barriers to prevent the people in each domain from communicating fully with the people in the other. The barriers were justified, in the tradition, as respect. Respect for the husband's expertise in finance, respect for the wife's expertise in domestic life, respect for the division that allowed each person to manage their domain without interference. But the respect in practice meant that the domains were not fully shared, and the people managing them were not fully informed about what the other person knew, and the household as a whole operated on the basis of incomplete information shared between two people who were not fully able to speak to each other about the things that mattered most. The inheritance is long. It is longer than the generation that practiced the silence, longer than the generation that partially reformed it, longer than the legal changes that made it legally unnecessary. It lives in the families that descended from these households, in the patterns of communication and financial management and domestic organization that were established in those households and passed down in forms that are recognizable if you know what to look for. It lives in the reflexes of women who were raised in families where the financial conversation was still, in some form, not fully had. It lives in the men who were raised in families where certain kinds of difficulty were still managed in silence. The inheritance is also beauty. The competence, the composure, the capacity for sustained effort in difficult circumstances, the ability to maintain something worth maintaining while conditions argued for its abandonment. These things were forged in the same silence that cost so much. They were the other side of the same coin, and they were passed down too, with the costs in the same atmosphere, into the same bodies, where they sit alongside each other, the gift and the wound, as inheritances tend to do. The legal changes of the middle 20th century altered the structural conditions that had produced the original silence, without immediately altering the cultural patterns that the silence had generated. Women who now had full legal personhood, who could own property in their own names, who could sign contracts and manage accounts, still moved through a social world that had been shaped by the decades before those legal changes arrived. The habits of mind formed in those decades persisted in the culture, in the families, in the women themselves, expressing themselves as preferences and reflexes that did not experience themselves as the residue of constraint, but simply as the way things were done. The therapy culture that developed in the decades after the war provided for some of these women and for their daughters and granddaughters the first context in which the silence could be named and examined as such. A woman who had been trained not to speak about the family's financial difficulties could, for the first time, speak about them in the therapist's office, could name what she had known, what she'd carried, what it had cost, what it had prevented. The speaking was not simple. It required the active dismantling of reflexes that had been in place for decades. But it was possible, and for the women who did it, it was the beginning of something. Not everyone did it. Many of the women of the generation that had practiced the silence carried it to their deaths, not because they were unable to speak, but because the speaking required a framework that they did not possess, or possessed only partially, or possessed in a form that their particular culture and family and social world had not activated. The silence was comfortable to them in the specific way that deeply habitual things are comfortable. Not pleasant, but familiar. The shape of the interior they had occupied for so long that a different shape was unimaginable. They died knowing what they knew, and the knowing died with them, and the families they left behind received the silence as their inheritance. The specific financial reforms that changed the legal landscape for married women in the United States accumulated across the 20th century in ways that were incremental and uneven but ultimately fundamental. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed at different times in different states, gave women the right to own property in their own names. Later reforms gave women access to credit independent of their husbands. Still later changes in divorce law gave women something approaching equal standing in the division of marital assets. Each of these changes altered the structural conditions that had produced the original silence, making the silence technically unnecessary, even if the cultural patterns that had generated it took longer to dissolve. The women who benefited from these changes were the daughters and granddaughters of the women who had practiced the silence under conditions that the changes were designed to address, and what they received was a freedom whose cost they could only dimly imagine, because the cost had been paid by the generation before. The inheritance of silence also extended to the relationship with money that these families passed to their descendants, a relationship characterized, in many cases, by an anxiety around financial discussion that persisted long past the conditions that had produced it. The grandchildren of the Depression-era wives sometimes described a sense of unease around conversations about money that they could not trace to any specific experience in their own lives, that seemed to come from somewhere earlier than their own memories, that felt like a reflex rather than a response to a specific circumstance. This unease was the inheritance of the silence, not as information, not as understanding, but as a physical response, a conditioning that had been laid down in the atmosphere of the households where the silence had been practiced and had passed into the bodies of the children who had grown up in those atmospheres. What has been lost in the general historical account of the Depression era is the specific texture of these women's domestic intelligence, the particular form of knowledge that the crisis years developed and refined, and that has not been adequately named or credited because the context in which it operated was private. The results it produced were attributed to the household in general rather than to any individual, and the skill itself was understood by the culture that produced it as not skill, as the natural and unremarkable functioning of a woman in her natural domain. The intelligence was real. The skill was real. The management was real. The history that does not name it has not fully reckoned with what the difficult years of the 20th century actually required of the people who kept the households of America functioning through them. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind, not information that can be retrieved and examined, but understanding that has been absorbed at a level below retrieval, that expresses itself not in thought but in response. The women of these families had this knowledge in abundance. They had spent decades acquiring it, through training and experience and the long education of living in close observation of human behavior, and it had settled into them at the cellular level, where it operated continuously without requiring conscious attention. They carried the houses, not just the memories of the houses, though they had those too, the specific quality of morning light in the east-facing bedroom, the smell of the library after rain when the windows had been left open, the sound the kitchen made when the cook arrived in the early morning and the particular sequence of sounds that followed, the filling of the kettle, the opening of the icebox, the creak of the larder door. These were in them as physical memories, as real to the body as the present moment, available without effort, surfacing at unexpected times. A particular smell in a new kitchen that called up the old one absolutely, a quality of afternoon light in an unfamiliar room that was suddenly the drawing room of the childhood home. They carried the competence, which was one of the things that survived the difficulty and the loss most completely. A woman who has learned to manage a household under constraint does not lose that knowledge when the constraint is lifted. It remains in her, a form of capability that becomes part of her character rather than a response to circumstances. The woman who had learned, in the difficult years, to cook well from a limited larder, to preserve the summer's garden for the winter table, to manage the household social life on a reduced budget without the reduction becoming visible. This woman had acquired something that was genuinely hers, independent of the fortune that had been lost, portable in a way that the fortune had never been. Many of the women who came through the difficult years and arrived on the other side found that this competence was one of the things they valued most about themselves in retrospect. Not because the difficulty had been good, exactly, but because the difficulty had required them to discover capacities they had not known they had required them to develop real skills that the prosperous years had not demanded, had given them a relationship with their own capabilities that the cushioned life had not provided. They had found out what they could do. The finding out had been uncomfortable. The knowledge was real. They carried the relationships. The marriages that had survived the difficulty were different in character from the marriages that had preceded it. Not necessarily better or worse, but different, marked by a shared experience that left a specific kind of residue. Two people who have managed a crisis together, even an unequal management, even a management in which the terms were not fully negotiated, know each other in a particular way. They have been present at something real. The social scaffolding has been absent and they have been visible to each other in ways that the scaffolding ordinarily prevents. This visibility was not always comfortable. Some of what became visible in the difficulty was not what either person had wanted to see. The husband's capacity for denial, the wife's stored resentments, the specific ways that each had failed the other in the years of crisis. These were present too in the marriages that had survived, and they had to be managed alongside the connection that the shared experience had deepened. The marriages that worked were the ones in which both people could hold the two things together, the genuine bond and the genuine damage, without collapsing either into the other. They carried the friendships, the real ones. The friendships that had survived the reclassification were friendships that had been tested and had held, and this made them different from the relationships that had surrounded them in the prosperous years. There is a particular quality to a friendship that has been present through difficulty, a warmth specific to having been known when the surface was not intact, when the performance was impossible, when the composed face was away, and what remained was simply the person. The women who made these friends, or who discovered that the friends they had made in the prosperous years were this kind of friends, had something that was worth more than the houses they had lost. They carried the grief. This is the honest accounting. The grief for what had been lost, the houses, the scale of the life, the specific pleasures of the prosperous years that had been real pleasures, the full table, the flowers from the florist, the particular quality of an evening when the household was at its best and everything was as it should be. These pleasures were not nothing. Their loss was not nothing. The women who had presided over those evenings and those tables had done something worth doing, had created something worth creating, and its loss was a real loss, and the grief of it was appropriate and lasting. And there was the other grief, the more private one, the grief for the years of silence, for the knowledge that had been held alone, for the love that had been expressed as management when it wanted to be expressed as conversation, for the words that had not been said when they should have been said, for the husband who had died or diminished without knowing what his wife had carried, for the children who had grown up in the maintenance of an appearance and had never been given the real account of what their parents had lived through. This grief was not about the money. It was about the silence, about all the things the silence had cost. Some of the women in old age broke the silence at last. They told their daughters and their grandchildren about what those years had been like. Not everything, not the full accounting, but some of it. A letter written in the last years and left to be found after death. A conversation on an afternoon when a granddaughter asked the right question, the question that gave permission, and the grandmother found that the answer was there, ready, as though it had been waiting all this time just behind the composed surface where she'd kept it. These tellings were not dramatic. They were not confessional in the sense of dramatic unburdening. They were more like recountings, a quiet, measured description of what had happened and what it had been like, offered to someone who would carry it forward, given as information rather than as performance. The grandmother who told the story had decided somewhere along the way that the silence was over, that the next generation deserved the truth of what the women before them had managed, that the management itself was worth knowing about even if the managing was done. What they carried, finally, was the household itself, not the physical house, which was gone or changed, but the household as a practice, as a set of capabilities and commitments and ways of being in a domestic space. They carried the knowledge of how to make a place feel like home, how to welcome people into a space and make them comfortable, how to produce, from whatever materials were available, an evening that felt like an occasion and a table that felt like care. This is not a small thing. It is in fact a very significant thing, and the women who carried it had developed it to a high art in circumstances that were not favourable, and they passed it to the people who came after them in the same way they had received it, not as instruction, but as atmosphere. The houses of the next generation had something in them that came from this, a quality of welcome, a capacity for making the domestic ordinary feel like more than ordinary, an understanding, absorbed from the atmosphere of childhood, that a household is a project, that it requires attention and skill and the daily recommitment of someone who has decided to take it seriously. The granddaughters who carried this forward did not always know where it came from. They experienced it as their own preference for a particular quality of domestic life, their own satisfaction in the well-set table, their own pleasure in a household that functioned as it should. These things were their own. They had also come from somewhere. The women who watched their husbands lose everything and said nothing were not heroines in any simple sense of the word. They were people in a specific historical and social position, doing what that position required of them, bearing what it required them to bear, passing forward what it required them to pass. They were the product of their time and their class and their training, and they cannot be understood apart from those contexts, and they would not have wanted to be understood apart from them because those contexts were not incidental to who they were. They were constitutive. They were the material from which these women had been made. But they were also more than the sum of those contexts. In the space between what they had been trained to do and what the situation required, something was exercised that was genuinely theirs, a judgment, a love, a commitment to the lives they were responsible for that persisted through years of difficulty without becoming bitterness or withdrawal. They managed what they could manage. They endured what they could not manage. They maintained, against the evidence, the belief that the household was worth maintaining, that the people in it were worth protecting, that the silence for all its cost was paying for something real. The house is very still at this hour. The clock in the hall has been quiet for some time. The woman in the drawing room has been there long enough that the room has accepted her into its silence, has arranged itself around her stillness as rooms do when the person in them stops moving. The street outside is empty. The rain has stopped. Through the gap in the curtain, a grey early light is beginning to come. Not dawn exactly, but the first suggestion of it. The night beginning to consider its end. She's not been writing. The paper is still blank, the pen still uncapped. But she's not going to write anything now. She's going to sit for a little longer in the particular silence of a house before morning, in the knowledge that the day will begin soon and will require her, and that she will be ready for it. She always is. She always has been. She will be again. The grey light is fully in the room now, gentle and diffuse, the particular quality of early morning light in autumn when the sun has not yet cleared the tree line, and the world is neither night nor day but somewhere between the two, suspended. The woman in the chair has not moved. She's very still, as she has always been still in these early hours, her hands in her lap, her face turned slightly toward the window, the light on her face very soft. She will get up presently. She will put on the kettle and set the kitchen to rights for the day. She will make the list of what needs doing and begin to do the things on the list that need to be done before anyone else is awake. She will be ready when the household needs her, which is to say she will be ready at all times, which is to say she will be ready without anyone noticing that readiness is itself a continuous act. This is what she has always done. This is what she will continue to do. The house holds her. The house has always held her. The walls with their plaster and their lath, the floors with their worn paths, the ceilings with their height and their accumulated warmth. All of it holds her, as a house holds the person who has tended it, who knows its sounds and its silences, who has moved through its rooms at every hour of the day and night for more years than she sometimes can account. She is part of the house. The house is part of her. This is not metaphor. It is the literal truth of what happens when a woman spends decades in a place, attending to it, knowing it, being known by it, in the way that only places can know us. Let the house be still. Let the morning come slowly as mornings do in autumn, without urgency, without announcement. Let the light fill the room from the east window. Let the woman in the chair rest a little longer before the day requires her. She has been awake for a long time. She has been managing for a long time. She has been carrying the knowledge for a long time, the long unbroken knowledge of what she saw and understood, and chose to carry without putting it down. She can put it down now, in this room, in this light, in this particular stillness before the day begins. She can rest. The question of what to make of these women, how to hold them in the historical imagination, how to understand them in relation to the larger questions about women's lives and women's power and the uses and costs of silence, is a question that resists a single answer. They were not heroines in the sense that heroism requires dramatic action in a public arena, and most of what they did was not dramatic and was not public. They were not victims in the sense that victimhood implies passivity, and they were not passive. Their silence was active, their management was skilled, their contributions to the survival of their families were real and documented in the outcomes. They were people doing something very difficult in conditions that were not of their choosing, with tools that were inadequate to the full scale of the problem, and the inadequacy of the tools was itself a condition imposed on them by the social and legal world they had been born into. What is perhaps most important is that they were specific, each one different, each one managing her specific household and her specific marriage and her specific situation with the specific tools her specific history had given her. The generalizations that can be made about them are real but partial, because any generalization about human beings is partial, because the specific person always exceeds the category. The Connecticut wife with her roses in the diary was not the same person as the Philadelphia Quaker with her charitable networks, and neither was the same as the woman in Virginia managing her husband's more complicated legacy. They were all silent. They were not all silent in the same way or for the same reasons or at the same cost. The history that treats them as a single figure has already lost something essential about each of them. The morning has come all the way into the room now. The lamp by the writing desk is less necessary than it was an hour ago. The grey light from the window is full enough that the room is visible without it. The furniture and the walls and the blank paper on the desk, all present in the morning in their ordinary forms, neither mysterious nor dramatic, simply there. The woman in the chair is visible in this light. Her face, her hands, the the stillness she has maintained through the hours since the clock last struck. She's not a young woman. Her face shows the years, shows the specific marks that sustained attention leaves on a person, the lines that form not from sorrow exactly, but from the sustained compression of feeling into a composed surface. The way that held things press outward from within and leave their trace on the face that has held them. She is going to get up now. The morning has arrived and the morning requires her, and she will be what the morning requires. She will be competent and present and attentive and composed. She will pour the coffee and speak to the cook and manage the day with the skill she has always brought to the management of days. None of this will be visible as labour. It will simply be the morning, proceeding as mornings do in a house where someone is managing it. The management will be invisible. The house will appear to run itself. This is the highest achievement of the work she's always done, that it looks, from the outside, like nothing is being done at all. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. The drawing room is still. The lamp by the writing desk gives off its small warm light, the only light in the house at this hour. The furniture holds its shapes in the half-dark, the chair, the sofa, the writing desk with its blank paper, the curtain with its gap where the grey light is slowly coming in from the street outside. The clock in the hall has stopped, or so it seems. The silence is very complete. There is a smell in the house that is the smell of old houses at this hour, of wood and dust and the particular warmth of a space that has been lived in for a long time, that has absorbed decades of life into its walls and its floors and its curtains, and gives it back slowly in the night, when the people are still and the house can breathe. The woman in the chair is very quiet. Her hands are in her lap. Her face is still. She's not asleep, not quite. She's in the space just before sleep, where thought has become very slow, and the body has begun to release the day, and the room around her is very soft, very distant, very gently arranged. The street outside is empty. A light somewhere in another house goes out. The garden is quiet. The roses along the back wall have finished their last bloom of the season, and the petals are on the ground, already returning to the soil that fed them. The kitchen garden is in its autumn state, the last of the root vegetables still in the ground, waiting for the cold that will come. The apple tree at the far end has dropped most of its fruit, and what remains is old and sweet, and going to the wasps and the birds. The house holds all of this. It holds the garden and the kitchen and the silver in the sideboard and the books on the library shelves and the linen in the closets and the china in the cabinet. It holds the years, the dinners, the evenings of music and conversation, the mornings of coffee and newspaper, the nights of worry managed in silence, the days of work that no one counted. It holds everything that was done here, and everything that was not said here, and everything that was loved here, quietly, without announcement. It is a very quiet house. You can rest now. The day has been very long, and the house is holding everything, and the grey light is coming very slowly through the gap in the curtain, and there is nothing that needs your attention before morning. Everything is as it should be. The house is still. The night is almost done. Let yourself go. Sleep. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.